1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across those states as well as across our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Getting directly into the headlines this morning. In the news, first up in COVID news, at least 1,265 new coronavirus deaths and 167,756 new COVID cases were reported in the U.S. on November 30th. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 160,000 new cases per day, an increase of 3% from the average 2 weeks earlier. The governors of Iowa and North Dakota have ordered residents to wear masks, and state leaders have imposed curfews in in Ohio and most of California. In an interview with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook yesterday, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said Monday that the majority of Americans who wish to get vaccinated for the novel coronavirus should be able to by April or May of next year. I'm going to quote from him here. So right now, the federal government is contracted with multiple companies to make about 600 million doses of vaccine, which would be good enough for around 300 million people getting vaccinated. Hence, everyone that you would imagine that would want to get vaccinated in the country would have a vaccine. And as we get into January the next year, and February, then March, by the time we get to April, we would likely have taken care of all the high priority and then the general population, the normal, healthy young man or woman, 30 years old that has no underlying conditions, can walk into a CVS or to a Walgreens and get vaccinated, end quote. Again, this is part of an interview he did on Facebook with Zuckerberg. Interesting to see them doing that personally. And I wonder, can't help but wonder what Zuckerberg is angling for there politically. But, that just comes up occasionally. The idea that he is at some point trying to run for president or some other political office. In any event, in related White House COVID news, Dr. Scott Atlas, a highly controversial member of the White House's coronavirus task force team, has resigned from his post in the Trump administration.
Good. Very good. He shouldn't have been there in the first place. The guy knows nothing about infectious disease. He was put there as a yes man. That's all he was put there for. So good.
I hear you. The Alphabet-owned AI research company DeepMind has developed a piece of AI software called AlphaFold that can accurately predict the structure the proteins will fold into in a matter of days. This is groundbreaking. It's a major advance. The latest version of AlphaFold has been recognized as a solution to this challenge by the organizers of the biennial meeting group known as CASP, which stands for Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction. It's a community experiment organization with the mission of accelerating solutions to one problem: how to compute the 3D structure of protein molecules. On Monday, the group said the DeepMind's AlphaFold system had achieved unparalleled levels of accuracy in protein structure prediction. Proteins are essential to life, supporting practically all of its functions. They're large, complex molecules made up of chains of amino acids, and what a protein does is largely dependent on its unique 3D structure. figuring out what shapes proteins fold into is known as the protein folding problem and has stood as a grand challenge in biology for the past 50 years. One way to look at this is if you have these chains of amino acids, you kind of have a 2D sequence, you have a 2D strip of these, of these different connections between these amino acids. And the combinatorics, the amount of math that it takes to figure out what 3D shape these would fold into is just immense. It's basically been an unsolved problem for a long, long, long time. I was paraphrasing here, but one of the quotes that I saw when I was reading up on this yesterday is people were predicting years ago that it would take more time than we have in the universe to compute like how your average larger protein is going to fold up, just based on that, looking at the 2D strip. So again, this is a big advance for AI. What this means for the future of, for instance, drugs or like interventions from a biological perspective, that is more unknown, and I'm not going to hesitate. I'm not going to venture a guess there. But regardless, big solution here, big advance in some sense. And again, coming from DeepMind, which is a company effectively owned by what you think of as Google. It's owned by Alphabet, which is the company that owns Google and the holding company for Google, really. When I hear Alphabet, I really hear Google. Anyway, the United Nations appealed Tuesday for a record $35 billion to provide humanitarian support for 160 million people next year. This as the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic has pushed millions into extreme poverty worldwide. According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quote, conflict, climate change, and COVID-19 have created the greatest humanitarian challenge since the Second World War, end quote. The UN says that some 235 million people, or 1 in every 33 people on the planet, requires aid or protection. This is a 40% increase over 2020. I just want to, this is also matching up with another headline I saw the other day, where basically I believe that we reported this on the air, our malaria cases, which had been going down for years and years and years due to like successful interventions, have basically stalled over the last couple of years. We've not successfully lowered malaria any further for potentially a variety of reasons. It didn't get into exactly what the detail is there. I don't know, man. There's this sort of been this like underlying supposition in Western society for quite a while now, I'd say for most of the last decade, that things in the world are generally getting better on some deep economic or scientific, technological level. People are coming out of poverty. With COVID, with this crisis, with the drop in our successfully lowering the rates of malaria around the world, I'm not sure that's true any longer. I'm just going to tie one other thing into this, Jamarl, and then I'll hand it over to you because I'm curious about your take. For decades, life expectancies in the U.S. and a number of other countries, but I'll just focus on the U.S., were going up and up and up and up slowly. So at one point it was in the 40s. Now it's, of course, in like the 70s. The last couple of years, for the first time in a very, very, very long time, life expectancies have started to drop. And I think it's for like the third year in a row or something at this point that they have continued to drop. You know what I'm talking about? What's your thoughts on this, Jamarl?
That's in the United States. That's not everywhere else. Places with healthcare, that's not true. Look it up. It's the United States that's taking these rates. The rates of people using drugs, for example, like overdosing. Those rates are happening here. That's not something that's happening everywhere else in the world. I could be wrong, but fact check me. The producers are in the background, if I'm not mistaken. I'm right on this. That's
true. It's true. One complicating thing there, and I'm not really kind of push back on the idea of healthcare being a good thing, caring for your health and having a system.
Shane Stranahan, strongly against healthcare. Right.
Exactly. No, but it's just this, it's this idea that life expectancy had been going up, and now, for reasons undiagnosed by the establishment, as far as I can tell, in large part, they're going back down. It's just like we didn't have a successful healthcare system.
No,
our healthcare system might be worse now, but arguably there's other stuff like obesity, potentially, autoimmune problems and problems with allergies and systemic lack of nutrition, like people living in food deserts. A bunch of people bring different things in.
No, that's true.
Including
it's a lot of things, but I'm just making a point. When times got hard, those countries that had healthcare systems didn't start losing people. The countries that didn't have a healthcare system did. I'm making a point that when everything is great, then everything is great. When things go bad, you need that social safety net. That's all. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
I hear you.
I would say this. We live, I think history is long. I agree with Martin Luther King on this. The arc of history is long, but it's been towards fairness. But the only reason it been towards fairness, I think, is because people inherently, something deep down, almost in the bones, in the DNA of what it means to be a human being, hates inequity. I think we hate it. I think we can see it. I think we identify it. And the moment that you find it to be unnecessary inequity, meaning if I play chess and I've played it for 20 years, we're going to have an inequity based on skill because I put in the time. It's a physical, natural inequity. Cash is not a natural inequity. A person who's starving versus a person who's stepping over that person to get into their limo, that's not a natural inequity. That's something that the society allows. And so I do think there's something to be said that, yeah, in the short term, things don't look like they get better. But over the course of 1,000 years, 500 years, they do seem to inch their way towards fairness. And I think that's because people, in those moments of inequity, push back against it. I think either things go bananas, there's fires, things fall apart, people lose it, they march, they protest, they set stuff on fire. But all of this with this notion of what's fair. The people could be wrong. They could be off. But what's fair? And right now, the people are often wrong in regards to the level of inequity they believe in our system. It's dramatically more than what the average person thinks. So no, I think it really does. Yeah, I think it does go in a direction. But I think we're wrong if we think that direction is automatic, and I think we're wrong if we think that direction is short term. Things can go bad.
How long can we tolerate the arc of history taking? I mean, you said 500, 1,000 years. The dream of the 60s is alive in Star Trek. I know that's true. I know that, there's this idea that at sometime soon, within the next couple hundred, I mean, it wasn't most of the events, for instance, Next Generation. I don't mean to get into a Star Trek tangent with you, but most of it was like in the 2200s,
like the 23rd century.
300s.
Earth had
exactly.
went through another world war.
Yep.
The world was devastated. And it was only at that point where the world and climate, believe it or not, they had gotten to the point where climate was tipping over to the point where it couldn't come back. And the people around the planet got their mind right. But think about all of that. That's like 300 years of people, of wars.
Well, that's pretty optimistic.
Yeah.
From what you're saying, you said 500, 1,000 years. That's a long time, man. Again, 50, 60 years ago, people were thinking we might have flying cars, Jetson style. You might have this sort of advanced space age with, the automation of most labor needs, and the average person is just sort of living in a bubble in the sky. That's a utopian dream. I don't know.
To the 1600s, and you compare the 1600s to now, dramatically different. Dramatically different. I mean, you're talking about cell phones, talking to people in midair on the other side of the globe. You're talking about bases on the moon, on other planets, sending stuff to Mars. I mean, it's not our flying cars. But the people 400 years ago would not have any context to the way we live our lives now. They would see things. They would get things. They would understand relationships. They will understand the way we engage with one another as human beings. They would even understand our politics. I mean, you could write a book back then for politics and it would still be applied now because people behave in similar ways. But our lives and how we interact would be dramatically different for them. I think the same thing would be true for us in 300 years.
Oh, man. We have successfully gone on a 2-minute tangent. I need to come back to the headlines. Interesting conversation as always. Just to be clear, China, back in the news. China has put into effect Tuesday a new export control law that allows it to block shipments to foreign companies for national security reasons. While no product list has been published, some observers say rare earth metals, more than 60% of which are produced in China, are likely among those facing export curbs. Should Beijing, for instance, blacklist an American company in response to pressure from Washington on Huawei, it could also retaliate against other companies complying with the U.S. sanctions against the Chinese company. The authorities in China had provided few details as of Monday on what products or companies would be subject to the new restrictions, but basically giving them more leeway to respond in kind to trade war practices coming from the Trump or potentially a Biden administration. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, a court in The Hague will hear claims that Royal Dutch Shell has broken Dutch law by knowingly hampering the global phase-out of fossil fuels. This is in a case that could force the company to reduce its CO2, carbon dioxide, emissions Lawyers for a consortium led by Friends of the Earth Netherlands will argue on the first of 4 days of public hearings on Tuesday that Shell has been aware for decades of the damage it has inflicted and is acting unlawfully by expanding its fossil fuel operations. Last year, the Dutch Supreme Court upheld a groundbreaking 2015 ruling ordering the Netherlands government to do much more to cut carbon emissions following a legal battle pursued by the nonprofit Urgenda Foundation on similar grounds. A Shell spokesman said the company agreed with the plaintiffs that the climate crisis needed to be tackled, but added that the legal challenges would not speed up the move to renewables. In Iran, lawmakers on Tuesday ratified the general outlines of a national plan to boost nuclear activity in the wake of the recent assassination of Iranian nuclear physicist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Media there reported, according to the Mehr news agency, the general outlines of the counteractive plan for the lifting of sanctions were passed with 248 votes in favor. And I'm going to quote here from the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission spokesman. Quote, the nuclear program should proceed according to the needs of the country, and we expect it to be strengthened after this move. And the aim of the plan is to counter the sanctions imposed on the Iranian people by American and Western countries, end quote. And 2 quick updates before we close out headlines. 1, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has announced that he's leaving the commission as of January 20th, 2021. That's the same day that President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in, at least if everything goes according to plan. Not a major surprise, as appointees often resign with a new administration coming in. For instance, former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler did the same when Trump took over back in 2017. Pai will be remembered for his decision to strip net neutrality protections that were put in place under the Obama presidency. That's update 1. Update 2 is Facebook will begin paying UK news publishers for stories. Facebook's dedicated news tab, first seen in the US, will launch in the UK with a promise to pay UK news sites to license articles. It'll arrive in January 2021 with partner sites including The Guardian, The Economist, and The Mirror. The company hopes to match its success in the US, where it's found that, quote, more than 95% of the traffic Facebook News delivers to publishers is new audiences that have not interacted with those news outlets in the past, end quote. I just want to highlight this one for a second, because not only, of course, is Facebook blocking certain stories, focusing on fake news and trying to suppress it, whatever they deem fake news, along with the sort of, other members of the optical establishment. But now they're, of course, also working in a for-profit relationship with news publishers to push certain stories. So it's not just suppressing certain stories, it's also, pushing certain narratives of things. I'm just pointing this out. I mean, it's what you'd expect from a tech giant, but, you got to pay attention to the actual mechanics of these things. In any event, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And by the way, a quick note, just before we go into the break, to listen to Jamarl's monologue, that AlphaFold DeepMind story on neural nets and the protein structure folding problem, we're going to be talking about that tomorrow with a guest. Just stay tuned for that. Come back to it. We're going to be talking in more depth about it.
Good.
Exactly. Interesting stuff. It's a big advance. Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. More dystopic AI news and general news later. Be back in just a minute with Jamarl Thomas's monologue.
Fault Lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like and share that audio or video. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. One of the interesting things that has been taking place is in the Biden transition. Transitions are always interesting because there's always this question of what is the president-elect going to do? Regardless of what they said in the primaries, regardless of what they said during the election, there's still this question, especially if it wasn't a mandate. Meaning, if it wasn't the person saying, I'm going to pass health care. That's my job. That's what I'm going to do. I don't care if anything else. We could have aliens attacking, and I'm going to be running, trying to get my last vote in to pass health care. My name is, Bernie Sanders. Or I'm going to work on military policy like a Tulsi Gabbard. Or even for Obama, I'm going to pass the Affordable Care Act. Whatever that meant. I'm making a point that when a politician runs, and they runs on a very specific mandate, that's one thing. But what happens when they don't? What happens when it's just, what I'm going to give you and what I'm going to give the American public is what the American public needs? Joe Biden. All right, now I'm going to take a nap. When that's the case, and you have people who basically, the majority of which, overwhelming majority, don't even like the guy. They just think it is my duty as an American to get Donald Trump out of office. So I don't care what Joe Biden does. I'll vote for him. When you're in that scenario, where you've inverted the politics, where it's no longer, I'm going to vote to get this guy in office because, we have a pandemic and, we have 30 million people out of a job and, we have climate devastation and, we have fires burning down California. When you have all of those issues, all of these people being thrown out of their homes, all of these people losing their jobs, and the best that the Democratic candidate can do is, I am going to give you Joe Biden. Well, when that's the case, you have no idea what you're going to get. But I would argue you do know what you're going to get. That I don't know what I'm going to get is just there, that wish, that hope, that you put this guy in office and hopefully he'll do something to ratify the reason that you put him in office. I felt the same way with Trump. I didn't vote for Trump, but when Trump got in, I thought to myself, there's a potential here. He's not beholden to the Republicans. He's not beholden to the Democrats. Maybe he would pull those troops out of the Middle East. Maybe he would increase the wage to $10 an hour. Maybe he'll do these things. Didn't expect him because he's a Republican, but the hope was there. And right now, I know a lot of lefties, a lot of people who voted for that Democrat on things that he said in the primary that he wasn't going to live up to, but there's hope. On things that he said in the general that he doesn't have to live up to, but there's hope. And the way that hope either gets dashed or at the very least emboldened, at the very least in the beginning during transition, are the people who they put into those offices. I like to say people or policy. And the person gives a clear indication of what the person is going to do. If Joe Biden chooses Rahm Emanuel, I guarantee you it's not going to be for anything pertaining to left-wing politics. This is the man who hid the execution of a black man in order to protect the cops in Chicago. Literally hid it. The video had to be leaked in order to kind of pull that apart. The same guy who hid the fact that lead was all throughout the water system in various areas and neighborhoods in Chicago, while at the same time this was going on in Flint, Michigan. Hid it. I'm making a point that if you bring somebody like that into your administration, there's a certain, perspective that person is going to have in politics. And that perspective and that history gives you an idea of what they're going to do. Rahm Emanuel is being considered, right here. The president is strongly considering Rahm Emanuel to run the Department of Transportation, weighing the former Chicago mayor's experience on infrastructure spending against the concerns for progressives. The concerns for progressives, I will give you a heads up, don't matter. It's one of three things. Either Joe Biden is making these choices to trigger progressives. Either Joe Biden is entirely apathetic about what progressives think and want, or it's a little bit of both. I'm choosing these people because I like them, and the fact that it annoys progressives, just a little bit better. My assumption, my idea of this is lefties are being put on notice. I don't need you. I don't need you to such an extent, or you're a captive audience to such an extent. Like he told the other guy, go vote for the other guy. If you don't like my climate policy, vote for the other guy. If you don't like my healthcare policy, go vote for the other guy. That is explicitly an understanding you have nowhere else to go. And progressives, the lefties, tells him, we don't like you saying that, but you're right. So, okay. Joe Biden is going to put Republicans in administration. He's going to put Rahm Emanuel, most likely, regardless of the complaints. He's going to put in near Tanden for Office of Management and Budget. Also, I wouldn't even be shocked if Deborah Wasserman Schultz comes strengthening the administration. Can you imagine him bringing in Hillary Clinton? I don't know, Deborah Wasserman Schultz, head of election integrity. Hillary Clinton, head of national security, or some kind of national security advisor. And what are progressives going to do? Nothing! Nothing! You're going to do squat. You're going to sit on Twitter and complain. You're going to go on writing articles, complaining. You're going to talk about our history. You're going to talk about all of these things that they did in their political campaigns during their time trying to be president, all of these things that they did to progressives, all of these hits, and all of it. You're going to talk about all that stuff. And at the end of it, none of it mattered because you voted for Biden. And Biden has been in politics for 40-something years, and it was not unclear what he was going to do when he got into that office, especially when each and every lever of influence you had evaporated the moment he won. Your influence was before he got elected. Your influence was when there was a question of whether he could get elected. Your influence was the ability to look in the face of the abyss and still say, despite me seeing the abyss, I am not going to immediately give over my constitutional right to have that guy represent my interests and come in and get my vote. And if 20 million people did that, Mayor Tanden wouldn't be here now. Rahm Emanuel wouldn't be here now. This pit in the stomach of all of these lefties that ended up voting for Biden and they get slapped in the face by a candidate that is right now, I would argue, putting you on notice. This is not going to be an administration where he feels he needs and values you. At the end of the day, you voted for him for nothing. He offered you nothing and you were willing to give him everything. And right now you're seeing the results of this. To me, if Biden does two things, this will be a success because I have no expectations. If he deals with the marijuana issue, meaning expunge these records, okay. If he deals with something with climate, expanding the number of solar panels and so forth, and actually tries to deal with it even if it's modest, okay. But I need to get across how little expectations I have. I have the expectations of him expanding the wars in the Middle East. I have the expectations of him giving a bunch of climate money to corporations and companies as opposed to giving those monies to individuals to ensure that those jobs remain here in the United States, to ensure that food deserts are eliminated, to ensure that homes have rebates and kickbacks to incentivize the use of solar panels and incentivize those things to be built here. Believe it or not, Donald Trump did that. He did that. He incentivized it being built here. It has something to do with the products and where those products are being bought. I'm just making a very basic point that right now it seems that the Democratic Party is doing everything it can to put lefties on notice that this administration, regardless of what you thought you might have accomplished in regards to the task force to mean anything, regardless of what you thought you accomplished with Sanders almost taking it into South Carolina, with plutocrats jumping in the race because they were so terrified that Sanders was going to take it. Chris Matthews not being able to control himself and getting himself fired on national television because he was so freaked out and perturbed by the fact that Sanders might take it and change the Democratic Party for a generation. Matthews, creature of the Democratic Party, even made the basic point, maybe we should tank it. So at the very least, if Trump wins it, Sanders doesn't win it for a generation. This is the man that they call a walking apocalypse. But at the very least, they understood that if Sanders took it, just like FDR, the perspective, the idea, what it meant to be a Democrat, what it meant from the standpoint of that party, meaning healthcare, education, Social Security, and ensconcing those things, making those things crystal clear and solid that this is what we stand for. That is what a Sanders administration meant. Chris Matthews understood that. The Democratic Party understood that. And the last thing they wanted to happen was that. So what we have right now is basically Biden, and he will give you incremental stuff. And just like the other administrations of Democrats, that incrementalism, even though it's not enough, even though it doesn't soothe the rough edges of capitalism, that incrementalism is all you get. And what he would argue is the Republicans won't give you that much, so you better love the fact that you're getting this. I would make the very basic point. The progressives are being put on notice that these picks, yes, these are picks that Biden wants. Yes, these are picks that are in line with Biden's thinking of the world. Near Tanden, she wanted to cut Social Security. She was against Medicare. She bragged about Medicaid cuts that Obama was making. Rahm Emanuel, again, I gave you a little bit of his history. I'm making the point that these people are being put there not because they trigger you, but because he's apathetic towards you. And that, to some degree, is even worse. Shane, what do you think? Do you know who Rahm Emanuel is, or do you know who Near Tanden is?
Yes, I do.
All right. What do you think about these picks? Is this done to tell lefties to basically F off? Or is this done because he's so apathetic he just doesn't care?
I think it's chosen by other people on his team, and probably he has close associations with them. But broadly, I'll come back to what I was saying yesterday, which is they're all swamp creatures. They all exist not just within the same political class, but within the same, relatively small clique within that political class. And so, it's cronyism. You're rewarding your buddies. You reward the people who can provide you some assistance over the years. And they're part of the DNC establishment, just how it works. And the fact that the DNC establishment does not include progressives is the fault of both the DNC and progressives. I don't know how else to split that joint. It is the fault of it is the lack on both sides, which is where it comes back to what your fundamental contention is. I believe it keeps coming back up in these monologues, which is lefties, quote unquote real lefties, need to push back and push away. And to the extent that they can successfully do that, if that's going to hamstring the DNC, then the DNC will be in some sense better off for it, because they're going to suffer and they're going to have to adapt their policies to a left-wing narrative. Now, it's an open question whether or not that's enough to hamstring the DNC, or whether the lefties will just be isolating themselves. And that is the fundamental question here. But, one to come back to on the other side of a couple of experiments and larger tests. Anyway, we've got to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A lot to talk about here, and we'll be talking about it throughout the show, I'm sure. We'll be back in just a minute. Again, Fault Lines.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are joined by our guest, Adejayan Oluwagbenga. I'm just going to do a name check right up front here. Is that how I pronounce that, Adejayan Oluwagbenga? Is that correct?
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, I just wanted to double check that I'm getting your name right. It's Adejayan, right?
Yeah, Adejayan Oluwagbenga.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah, we are. Okay. Good to hear. We are joined by Adejayan Oluwagbenga, award-winning journalist, opinion writer, and publisher with varied experience in Nigeria. Also, the online editor at WithinNigeria.com. We're talking about a recent Boko Haram attack that killed over 100 rice farmers in Nigeria. Boko Haram, as far as I know, a sort of Islamist affiliate group of ISIS, part of this wider Islamist movement. And it's kind of fallen out of the news. Well, occasionally in the U.S., we'll talk about what's going on in Somalia, what's happening in Syria specifically. But what's happening in West Africa has persisted for years. A lot of people have been killed. The last thing that a lot of people heard about from Boko Haram was the school children, the girls specifically, who were kidnapped en masse a number of years ago. But this has been a continuous thing. Can you please, Adejayan, please tell us what's happened over the last few months and what led to this most recent event?
Yeah, thank you for having me on Fault Line. Actually, let me start by saying that the northern part of Nigeria is now the epicenter and theater of insurgency. And from the Boko Haram terrorism, banditry, kidnapping, and so many others. The killings is a typical example of the nonchalant attitude of the government to the security challenges facing the North. Many stakeholders have called the clamoring for the sacking of the security chiefs, but the presidency said there's no point about that. That the presidency will keep the security chiefs. That was the latest development today by the presidency. The president said that is out of place. The clamoring for the sack of security chief is out of place, and as long as their performances, the president is satisfied with their performances. So there is no point in sacking the security chiefs. So on Saturday, about 40 rice farmers were killed in the Jamarl area of area in Borno State, and many people have been reacting to it, especially Nigerians and international communities. The UN came up with a report on Saturday. The UN said the UN earlier said that about 110 were killed. But
wait, I'm sorry, Adejayan, I'm going to have to cut in here. We should try to get you back on it some other time. This connection is very bad, and I can see that this is the only way we have in for you. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut this short. It is very difficult for us to understand what you're saying. I thank you so much for being willing to join us, though. In any event, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I guess I'll just do it like this. Let's get back into this conversation we were having, Jamarl. You gave a monologue. I kind of responded with that. You were talking about Rahm Emanuel, Tanden, and Biden's absolute rejection of any semblance of real left-wing politics in a Democrat White House, going into a Democrat White House in 2021. The thing I was saying at the end, I'm going to come back to now. It seems like all that lefties are left with at this point, and it's a question of whether or not it'll work. And different people will have different answers to this question. All that lefties are left with at this point is, do we push away? Do we sort of use the battered housewife metaphor? Do we leave this relationship? Do we walk out the door? And if you do, where are you going to go? If you become sort of existentially dependent on the support and the relief that this relationship provides you, what happens? Where do you go when you leave that relationship? That's an open question that people always have to face. And I think the fact that there is no answer to that question right now has sort of spelled the doom for any kind of a left-wing movement over recent years, if not decades. But there's still that question. I mean, where do you go? There's a People's Party. We've talked about that before. You talked about potentially a third-party choice. Do you think there's any chance, I'll put it this bluntly, do you think there is any chance within the next, say, decade that the progressive left can reform the DNC, or is it all third parties and boycotts? Jamarl?
To me, where you go is less relevant. What's more important that you go? Because understand the scenario. Let's use the battered wife metaphor. Your husband slaps you. He beats you. He sleeps with the maid. You are dependent upon him for cash. Let's say you may even have kids. You don't have a job. You're a homemaker, etc. But he does all of these things. He always apologizes. And during certain times and certain moments where you seem to be at your worst and you're at your wit's end, they'll be like, hey, I do love you. And he touch you on your cheek. He may, pinch you on the butt a little bit when you're going by to make you feel sexy. But ultimately, it's going to go back to slaps, beating, not washing his hands, fixing your ham sandwich, hitting on the maid, having relationships out of the wedlock. The catch becomes whether you believe you know, maybe if you don't even if you don't know whether you have somewhere else to go, do you stay there and accept that? And is it possible that when you leave, opportunities arise? The answer is yes. Opportunities always arise when you're forced to do something. Now, those opportunities may not be great in the beginning, and when you're starting off from scratch, you're always building it up. But this is like a job. Like if you're working a job, you hate that job, but you stay on that job because there's, let's say, a better salary. But it is driving you into the ground. You're not able to get your own points of view out. You're not able to do what you want to do from the standpoint of getting things accomplished. And you know that the people who are at that job are not even looking out for your best interests. You're just there because of the paycheck. I'm saying all of these situations, at some point, you got to cut loose in order for you to even be aware of new opportunities. For them to say you have nowhere else to go, it's not true. You do have somewhere else to go. You can leave. And not voting is a vote. I mean, I know people, this is not just out of, okay, I'm just not going to vote because, I'm not. No, that non-vote is a vote of displeasure. It's a vote of, I am not accepting this. And fact of the matter is, millions have already done that. I mean, the fact that Democrats lose the House of Representatives at all is a testament for it, considering they used to own it for like 50 years. The fact that the president, that Joe Biden, barely won after the president has like 200,000 deaths on his back. Like it's hard to get across how miserly and weak and worthless this party is. And because Republicans basically offer nothing, Democrats believe they can offer incremental amounts. Incremental.
But here's the other side of it, man. I mean, you're calling them, the word that sticks out to me is not miserly, it's weak. I mean, aren't lefties just politically at this point, if not intellectually, you could have these different conversations, aren't they kind of weak? I mean, I'm being really blunt and critical here.
Yes.
But
weak,
there's like
all of that.
A lack of political organization. And I mean, frankly, a part of it comes down to, I think, the ideas. I mean, it's technically right. Healthcare is a good thing, for instance. Reforming our education systems, a lot of this stuff, averting a climate catastrophe and trying to focus on ecological restoration. I'm kind of, pushing the boundaries of what it means to be a lefty, maybe slightly in some ways, but broadly, those are on point in a lot of ways. Programs of economic justice, whatever the word justice means in that context. These are all in some sense good things, but these are also all relatively old ideas. And I don't know, man, it's not just political engagement. I don't see these mobilizing the masses. Now, here's the thing. One big thing that cuts against that is Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders specifically, I believe, was offering debt relief for students. And so that was a sort of big demographic pull on a lot of younger folks. It's also offering a more comprehensive healthcare reform, but broadly, he was pushing back against the serious economic inequality and putting forward proposals that would try to fix that. In some sense, that was actually pretty exciting. It was like it had this like Occupy-esque excitement in that, okay, here's this guy who actually might solve these deeper underlying economic issues. But is that he was what, 70s? He's an old dude, notoriously an old guy. Those aren't new ideas. Those might be exciting, but they're not new ideas. And in some sense, that represents like an ideological weakness, doesn't it? Like a deeper conceptual weakness in the framing and
I know what you
the
mean.
Symbolism.
It just feels like
political mythology.
It just feels like they keep going back to something as opposed to trying to move forward. And so it's like the ideas that FDR put out there, it's like, let's just go back to those ideas. And, I asked the question, why do you need a new deal? You know what I mean? Like, why do you need a new deal? If the New Deal did everything that you needed it to do, so much so that you're going back to it, why do you have to go back to it? There's something else there. There's something that happened that basically undermined it. And regardless of how good it was at the time, it left out blacks because he couldn't get it through if African Americans were allowed in the New Deal. And let's be clear that there were forces that were allied or organized in the United States, especially from the standpoint of capital and cash, to be against it and undermine it. And without any kind of left push to fight for it, it was undermined. Meaning the party that initially pushed for this basically was bought out. They were captured, corporate interests, corporate capture. And so you get a Bill Clinton who attacks Social Security, wants to privatize Social Security, who destroys welfare, who destroys Glass-Steagall, who expands or blows up the prison population. Like, this was a Democrat. And so it's like the people who are pushing for the New Deal policies and everything else, despite this feel your pain language that these guys talk in, at the end of the day, when you get down to real brass tacks, the party itself destroyed the New Deal policies. Now the catch becomes, what does it mean for the left? And the left stayed there, despite the philosophical responsibility, the thing that's ingrained in a cosmic way, to fight to ensure that people have health care, to ensure that people aren't living on the streets, to ensure that the worst aspects of capitalism is ameliorated. They didn't do that. Out of fear, they thought, okay, Bill Clinton is better than nothing, so let's just go with the Democrat. And they went year after year for the last 40, 50 years with Democrats telling them you have nowhere else to go, and with the left basically agreeing. You're right. That is a weakness. That is a weakness from the standpoint of courage. That's a weakness from the standpoint of ideology. And look, you make the point all the time. We are in a technological era. And the technology, the things that we have at our disposal can be used to deal with these issues. Whether it's education, for example, meaning the technological capabilities that we can have to do some of this stuff online as opposed to being in class, especially for secondary degrees and whatnot. People like in West Virginia, coal miners, who we don't want them doing that. We need them to do something else. All right, well, you got to give them a pathway. Otherwise, they're going to be hateful of you and your party for trying to take away their meal ticket. I guess I'm saying these things, I'm not overtly picky about how they're solved. I just want them solved. I want people to have health care. I don't want people living on the street. I want people to be able to get their education when they want it. I want Social Security expanded. I want an increase in wages. I want people to be able to live a decent life, because I don't think we can have a decent society, meaning from a standpoint of crime, from a standpoint of poverty, without those things being attacked. Let's do this. Let's take a break, and we can talk about this. I also want to talk about Google Update, that device, that new protein thing. That protein thing is big. I don't think people get the gravity of that and what that means for medications, what that means from understanding our own biology. When you can predict what a protein is going to be, imagine what you can do in regards to medications, in regards to healthcare. All of those things come into acute focus. So let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a very short moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're having a conversation. We're also taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. Our phone lines are open. If you'd like to join us, you can. Yeah, so we're talking about Google. We're talking about specifically this DeepMind neural network that seems to have solved this long-lasting, long-term problem in the biological sciences. Basically, it has to do with the structures of proteins. So proteins, chains of amino acids. You have these, if you think about it, it's like a 2D chain of different amino acids of these different molecules. And the different proteins have different amino acids linked up in different shapes. Anyway, those chains can be sort of folded up, if you think about it, like almost like origami. The protein itself, a larger biomolecule, will fold up into a unique 3D shape, but it's difficult to predict exactly what shape that is. And it's, obviously these are microscopic. You can't exactly see them. They're very, very small. And knowing in advance what shape they're going to move into, it's a mathematical problem, sure. But if you were to just do the raw math, if you were to just sort of brute force compute it, it would take longer than we have. It takes so long for each one. And of course, there are many, many different proteins. Anyway, this neural network, AlphaFold, yesterday was announced as apparently having solved this problem, having the being the most effective tool at solving this problem of any developed so far. And if you think about us being still in the relatively early days, what we might consider in the future the halcyon days of neural networks, of deep learning, these different sort of overlapping technologies built on modern computing infrastructure to be able to solve problems that, the human brain in some sense is built to solve. That's why they're called neural networks. We're still in if we're still in the early days of this stuff, you can assume that it's going to get better over time. Seems like a pretty safe assumption. And the same tools, by the way, deep learning neural networks, these are what we use to solve the game of, not solve, but to learn and play very well the game of Go, for instance. Anybody who's a video gamer, you're probably following when StarCraft 2, this game was basically beat by neural nets, where all human players were inferior to, I believe it was not AlphaGo, but it was one of these, I forget the exact name of the one that beat StarCraft. AlphaGo is the one that won Go, effectively won the game of Go, is now better than any human player at the game of Go. Anyway, same technologies used in dramatically different domains. I mean, think about it. Comparing.
That's not true for chess, though. Human beings are still superior.
Last I checked, what was it? Last I checked,
Kasparov got beat. Don't get me wrong, but that was years ago. Am I wrong? Like, check.
I'm pretty sure chess is done. I'm pretty sure chess is done. Now, the caveat on this is that if a player, if a human being and a neural net, or not even a neural net, but if a human being and an AI play together, they will outcompete. They'll beat out either another human being alone or another AI system alone.
I'm making the point that chess is played, like, I don't know about Go, but human beings and computers play chess in just fundamental different ways. And because of that, now look, to be fair, I haven't researched this recently, so I could be entirely wrong. So I could be talking squarely out of my backside on this. But I have seen computers get embarrassed by human beings and top computers because they play differently. Like, a computer can look up these brute force calculations, and they can brute force the stuff out to ungodly amounts of data. Human beings don't play chess that way. There are times where we do, but oftentimes we look at the board and we exclude certain things for conceptual reasons. Cognitively, it doesn't make sense for me to do that, so I'm not looking at that. Now, a computer would look at that, and it would go through all of these calculations, and it may find something that says, hey, that move that the human being says is a horrible move, that move works for a computer because it can get away with it. But when you get into situations where the computer is unclear and it has all of these options and it can't find a way to go, that's where human beings excel. Positional chess is the area where human beings outplay computers. Now, that may have changed just from the standpoint of the more calculations you do, maybe you can get over that hurdle. But I could be wrong on this. And tell me if I'm wrong. If one of the producers or somebody researched it and they could find that the computer is a champion in human chess, then fair enough. I'm not going to, I don't have time to do that research. Very briefly, I mean, I'm pretty sure that it is. I'm pretty sure that that's been the case for a while. And there have also been recent advances coming from Google, coming from the same DeepMind company research lab thingamajigger. I've been following this guy been following this organization for years now. Used to live out in the Bay, and I was kind of there and in some of these AI safety and AI research communities when this thing started up a while back. Anyway, their neural nets are actually beating the earlier generation of computers that themselves beat humans. So I think that we're sort of long past that point. Now, the caveat on that, we've got 3 callers. The caveat on that is that, again, last I checked, if a computer and a human are working together, to put it simply, they will beat either a computer or a human alone, which for a lot of people was indicative of the long-term trajectories of where this stuff would go. You'd have some sort of weird merger or symbiosis, the Great Reset style merger between humans and computers. Anyway, don't want to put too much stock in that. I don't know if that's true, though. You're saying that's been true for a while. I don't accept that. I mean, you just said, I'm not even going to look it up, but I think that's true. If you're not going to look it up, I know it's true. Yes, he beat Kasparov. Kasparov wasn't playing like Kasparov. Kasparov was playing like he was terrified of the computers. But I don't know if it's a flat fact, if that's true. And apparently Magnus Carlsen refuses to play the computer. So there's that. But you had other Nakamura destroyed the computer and had like 8 queens beating the best of the computers. So it's not a foregone conclusion. I'm just saying they play chess different ways, the computers. And whether the computer has gotten over the hurdle or not, I don't know yet. But let's go to the callers. Let's just keep that as an open question. How about that? That's all.
We can come back to it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we got callers on. Greg, calling in from DC. Greg, you're on the line. What's going on?
How you guys doing? I listen to you guys at least from 7 to 8, then I jump on Democracy Now, then I jump back to you guys. But I have an ideological question or a political question for both of you to answer, and then one quick kind of curious personal question. Are you related to Lee Stranahan?
I am. I'm that guy's son.
Okay. Father, cousin, uncle?
He's my father. He's my dad.
He's your father. Okay, all right. And then Jamarl, my question for you is I actually have started content creation. I've been watching you for a couple of years when you first started your show. I actually wanted to interview you for a podcast. If I wanted to follow up with that, just if you could let me know what the best contact information is for you, if that's okay with you. And then my question for both of you guys is the segment prior you were talking about, what lefties are going to do. I was a Sanders supporter. I consider myself a progressive voter. In the last couple of months, there was a movement for the People's Party. They had a big thing. I wanted to find out from either or both of you if you think that is a viable solution, and if so, how quickly?
So, yeah, the movement for the People's Party. I even did like a 5-minute thing for them. What's interesting is that many of the people who are in the movement for the People's Party still voted for Joe Biden. Now, how are you going to have a secondary party with people voting for, it's not that they were on the ballots and everything else. And from the standpoint of time frame, I got to be honest, I don't know. I mean, the honest reality of it is, as long as the left puts their lot in with Democrats, you're always going to have this bifurcation. It's not even a bifurcation. You get like 70 or 80% of lefties just voting for whatever random Democrat, regardless of what the Democrat does. And so it becomes difficult for any of the energy to get into something else when those people know that ultimately, regardless of what the Democrat does, they vote for him. And so I don't know how long that takes. I mean, if you had somebody like a Sanders that breaks off, Sanders would almost immediately rip the party in half, which is why it's so important to make sure that he tells people to vote for Democrats, and why it's perfectly okay for him to be in the Democratic Party from the standpoint of the primary, especially when they know he's going to lose, because ultimately he is not going to do that. He is not going to sever or rip the party that way. They know it, so he's in. So it's hard to give this kind of idea on how long it's going to take. It's going to take as long as progressives dump their energies into Democrats. The day that ends, the day our world changes. Because look, and just to make this brief, even if you don't believe that a third party works, it is still in your best interest to back them. Because the number of people that are being pulled into the third party forces an appropriation of policies by Democrats. The Green New Deal wasn't something that was a Democratic policy. That was a Green Party policy that was appropriated by Democrats in the form of AOC, who then pulled Democrats in that direction for them to even talk about climate. Well, that's something that took place from the standpoint of policy that needed to be appropriated because it was a necessary policy to appropriate. I hope that makes sense. It's not one of those things where I think overnight a People's Party is going to work or a Green Party is going to work. It really does take a large number of people being willing to leave for the Democratic Party to get his mind right and be like, wait, we got to appropriate those. Otherwise, it's going to search for Republicans because they believe you are a captured bunch, whether that's black or whether that's lefties. Shane, tell me if I'm wrong on this. We have other callers, but like from what you've viewed of the left and the politics and just politics in general over these past few months, am I wrong on this? Is it really one of those things where the left is a captured bunch and Democrats, realizing they don't have to go for that bunch, basically went out to try to get Republicans?
It's complicated, but broadly I agree. But we should go to other callers. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Got about a minute here until we've got to go into a break. A little bit less than that, in fact. What's on your mind, Tarif?
Yeah, I have 3 comments. Max Blumen on Twitter out this guy named Daryl Blanco that might be lead the CIA. He's African American, so I'm thinking on that he might there might be a way into
One.
try to take Africa away from, China, to destroy the Belt and Road Initiative. I wish I can go deeper into that. But IRGC commander was killed yesterday by a drone strike in Syria. I think Israel did it. My last but not least comment is release the documents, free Julian Assange, look into my case as Mike Reed debating, free other whistleblowers and activists too.
Great call. Tarif, we got to go into a break, opening up headlines on the other side of this break, but Tarif, great call. Every color of the panopticon coming into the Biden administration here. Great identity politics for the national security establishment. And in any event, we need to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,265 new COVID deaths and 167,756 new cases were reported in the United States on November 30th, basically yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of 160,387 cases per day, an increase of 3% from the average 2 weeks earlier. The governors of Iowa and North Dakota ordered residents to wear masks. State leaders have imposed curfews in Ohio and most of California. We should also note that the Supreme Court basically went against Cuomo in New York, so church services are open. Cuomo felt some kind of way about that. The issue had to do with whether or not people who were going to religious services were allowed to. Meaning, if you were shutting down like gyms and these other things, should church services also be held to the same standard? The court basically said, no, the church is apparently something different. And so worshipers can go despite the state being against it. Amy Coney Barrett come into her own almost immediately. In an interview with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Anthony Fauci, said Monday that the majority of Americans who wish to get vaccinated for the novel coronavirus should be able to do so by April or May of next year. Quote, so right now, the federal government is contracted with multiple companies to make about 600 million doses of the vaccine, which would be good enough for around 300 million people getting vaccinated. Hence, everyone that you would imagine would be who want to get vaccinated in the country would have a vaccine. Unquote. As we get into January and the next year, this is also quote started. As we get into January and into next tier and February, then March, by the time we get to April, we will likely have taken care of all of the high priority in the general population. The normal, healthy, young man or woman, 30 years old, that has no underlying conditions, can walk into CVS or Walgreens and get vaccinated, Fauci said. In related White House COVID task force news, Dr. Scott Atlas, a person with no experience in infectious disease, highly controversial member of the White House coronavirus task force team, has resigned his post in the Trump administration. the number of deaths that is on that man's behavior is uncountable. The Alphabet-owned AI research company DeepMind has developed a piece of AI software called AlphaFold that can actually predict or accurately predict the structure that proteins will fold into a matter of days. And a major advance, the latest version of AlphaFold has been recognized as a solution to this challenge by the organizers of the biennial meeting group known as CASP, which stands for Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction. It's a community of experiment organization with the mission of accelerating solutions to one problem: how to compute 3D structures of protein molecules. On Monday, the group said that DeepMind's AlphaFold system had achieved unparalleled levels of accuracy in protein structure prediction. Proteins are essential to life, supporting practically all of its functions. There's a large complex molecule made of chains of amino acids, and what a protein does largely depends on the unique 3D structure. Figuring out what shapes proteins fold is known as the, quote, protein folding problem, and has stood as a grand challenge in biology for the last 50 years. Shane, that is a big deal. Like, it's hard to get across how big of a deal that is if these guys can accurately predict protein. Oftentimes you hear people talk about DNA. They will say, oh, we can predict DNA now. We have the human genome. But in all reality, that's one aspect of it. Proteins was also this other hard problem. And if they're able to solve it, that is phenomenal. Let me ask you something. From the standpoint of research, I think you'd agree with me that science has to be open in order to be effective. If you have one group working on something that cords off and says, okay, we're going to work on this because we own it, their minds are only going to be able to get so much information, as opposed to having a large community working on these hard problems. Do you think to some degree that our system and the way that we operate basically slows down science? Like, even though we have, all of these companies and everything else, and these companies are working on whatever these companies are working on, the fact that these companies are for profit, and the fact that they draw a circle around various research, be it medical or be it technical, basically prevents other groups from working on the same information, groups that may actually have different and better ideas. We basically are hobbling ourselves in this world from the standpoint of our scientific progress. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would, and some people would see that as a positive thing, and not just for purely self-interested motives, but because they believe they're operating out of a pursuit of a higher good. Take, for instance, either like biochemical research, literally has to do with what we're talking about, or artificial intelligence research, also, of course, has to do with what we're talking about. If you're publishing willy-nilly the results of your papers, what you might be doing is making it easier for other people to create bioweapons, or for other people to create some sort of runaway, self-perpetuating, recursively self-improving artificial general intelligence system that, then goes on to take over some sectors of the world or the world itself. I know that sounds catastrophic, but a lot of people are pretty worried about this stuff. On the other hand, so in other words, if you're publishing your research, to be clear, you might make it easier for somebody else with worse motivations or with less prudence to use that research, capitalize on it, and then they publish something that has dramatically negative follow-on consequences. On the other hand, that argument can be used to keep your profitable research private. Can be used to give you more power in a way that's purely self-serving and purely self-interested. I don't know how you break that knot. I don't know how you're supposed to square that circle. But both of those are true. Some of these, particularly with areas of research that can lead to dangerous outcomes, I don't know what you do to solve that. As far as I know, that problem itself is an open and unsolved and maybe unsolvable problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Reality allows us no easy outs. That's the answer, right? There is no solution because it's not necessarily a problem. It's something that we defined. It doesn't exist as a problem in and of itself. Meaning, those companies quoting off their research, I think you'd agree with me, even by what you just said there. Yes, it prevents progress, but that progress could be to the negative by people who want to take advantage of it for the worst ends. You're right. But it also means, by definition, if you have people on the other side that can make bad progress, you have people who can do great things with it. Meaning, the moment that you unleash it, it's unleashed. The public itself, the other groups can get involved in it, and some of those groups can have the best of aspirations, and some of them can have the worst. I think that's the honesty of it. I guess my point is, cording off that research does slow down progress. That's all. I think, but you can make an argument that that's for the positive. You can make an argument, I guess, that it's for the negative. Personally, I think all things being equal is for the negative overall. But I take the point. It could, go into bad ends. But we can talk about it later.
Absolutely.
The alpha thing it just blows my mind because it's such an advance. And you think to yourself, what if more people than just them were working on it? That's all. That's the only reason I come to that.
100%.
Yeah.
I can speak about this with a very small amount of authority because I know a bunch of folks. I know folks who very early on went to work with DeepMind, and in an interesting way, we should come back to it because we've got an open segment next segment. In an interesting way, DeepMind is more open than a lot of other folks, and some folks were worried about how open they were being and how open they still are with publishing their research. But we should come back to it.
It's at the point where computers. It's funny. The tech industry is almost basically a communist industry. And I say that jokingly, but to some degree true. As a software engineer, a lot of the products that I use were open source. A lot of the information you got where people were giving it away, software and so forth, it seemed to have this kind of aspect of, because the energy that's needed to do that stuff is minimized, then it was easy to give it away. So yeah, I want you to use my application. I feel great that you're using my application. Here is this bit of code. Here's the solution to the problem that you're trying to have with this bit of code. It is an industry where people continuously talk because we realize that makes us better. It expands our knowledge that much faster when that stuff is just being spread amongst millions of people. It is an amazing industry. So you're right. It probably was one of the more open test cases. But let's get back to the news. Like you said, we have an open segment next time. The United Nations appealed Tuesday for a record $35 billion to provide humanitarian support for 160 million people next year as the economic fallout from coronavirus pandemic has pushed millions into extreme poverty worldwide. According to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quote, conflict, climate change, and COVID-19 have created the greatest humanitarian challenge since the Second World War, unquote. The UN says that some 235 million people, or 1 in every 33 person on the planet, requires aid or protection. This is a 40% increase from 2020. China has put into effect Tuesday a new export control law that allows it to block shipments to foreign companies for national security reasons. While no product list has been published, some observers say rare earth metals, more than 60% of which are produced in China, are likely to be among those exports curbed. Should Beijing blacklist an American company in response to pressure from Washington on Huawei Technologies, for example, it could also retaliate against the companies complying with U.S. sanctions against Chinese company. The authorities have provided few details on Monday of what products the company would subject to new restrictions. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? I mean, let's be very bluntly honest here. The United States has basically taken an attack that it is attacking China because it realizes that it's going to be an economic powerhouse and that it is an economic powerhouse. It gets that the Belt and Road Initiative, that the interaction with all of these countries allow it influence politically and economically. And it's not being done through this kind of militarism. It's being done through pure win-win scenarios in the economic sphere. Why wouldn't they respond to the United States attacking Huawei, attacking TikTok, attacking Huawei, even in Britain and some of these other countries? Why wouldn't they respond by making it hurt for that, almost as a tit for tat? What do you think, Shane? I mean, is it just me? I mean, this is the way I look at politics. So this is the way I kind of like, just from a pull back away as if you're just a person sitting on the world. It seems that a tit for tat is necessary in order to maintain some level of balance between the two powers. Am I missing something?
There's the response to the Hammurabi argument, which is that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. On the other hand, if you don't do tit for tat, then you're setting yourself up for repeated oppression by some other party. So that's an old argument. I don't really, there's a lot more that could be said about that. But broadly, I agree with you. And we don't know how to handle that, frankly, because we have set ourselves up until Trump, arguably, we've set ourselves up with this sort of free trade neoliberal outlook on things where you try to, create as minimal a restraint as you possibly can on the course that the free market takes for providing goods and services to people around the world. And we did this largely built on the backs of Chinese labor. So largely built on the backs of the Chinese, China as a nation. Then, they've grown, they've succeeded, and they're using the same argument against us. And therefore, we don't know what to do. Trump, in some sense, was a lot more effective, I would say, with the trade war than a Biden administration could be. Because what's a Biden administration going to do? Militarism? Just keep pushing our ships right up next to their borders. Just keep doing that. Keep pushing them while they grow economically. Ultimately, in the long run, if they continue to grow economically, that's not going to work because their military is going to be more efficient than ours. Frankly, they're going to be able to throw more money at R&D, more money at manufacturing, and they're going to outstrip us. So Trump, in the sort of nationalistic, protectionistic vein, was able to do more than I think a standard U.S. politician could, but that's not going to last that long. Anyway, back to you, Jamarl.
There's also something interesting with that, too. Bang for your buck. How do you know you're getting the bang for your buck? So in the United States, you have companies that basically deal with the U.S. government. And those companies who are building these, ships and boats and planes and whatever else, how do you know that the company that is trying to get a profit out of it, trying to get a ton of profit out of it, especially working with the U.S. government, isn't just inflating costs? Meaning you're ending up paying more for less. So it's like, yeah, you're
100%.
getting that shit. Yeah, you get it. It's like, and not just that, how do you even know that it's effective? Meaning in the context of a war, oftentimes the very first incursion changes the strategy. Because oftentimes you get it wrong. Military doctrine that starts off in one thing changes. Look at the First, Second World War. It radically shifted between the first engagements in combat. How do you know that the stuff that you're buying is even the stuff that you need? Like, it seems like the $1 trillion military budget is a deterrence because it's a $1 trillion military budget. But putting that to the test, oh God, I don't want to do it.
How much of that pie is sawdust? We should come back on this one. I've got some stuff to say.
Exactly. So let's do this. You guys are listening to this. Oh, those are your headlines, fault lines, Thomas and Stranahan. So let's do this. Let's go into the next break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. This is an open segment, so we can continue this conversation. Also, we'll be taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And you know what? This might be a mistake. I'm going to open up the phone lines again. Brave, I saw you called in the last hour, at the end of the last hour, and we didn't have time to get to you. And I feel bad about that. And so I'm like, should I even be opening up the lines? We're just going to have our conversation. It's going to take as long as it takes. And if people call in and we don't get to them, I'm just going to feel like a jerk, and it will be wasting your time. So I don't want to do that. But Brave, for you specifically, if you want to call in, phone lines are open. If other folks call in too, I'm not going to hold it against you. Oh yeah, we've got him. You know what, Jamarl? I want to come back to our conversation about the military complex, but we have Brave on the line right now. Thank you for calling back in. Brave, you're on. What's going on, man?
Hey, good morning, guys. Don't feel bad at all. So this was a perfect example of what liberals and lefties and progressives need to do, right? So I was on hold. I saw time was ticking down. I didn't like my choices, so I decided to pull out. So I wouldn't get relegated to the last few seconds. And then I called back later, making another choice. And if Democrats do the same thing, if liberals do the same thing, then maybe we can get some change. But no, actually, I was calling in for that actual conversation you guys were having earlier, and I feel like we're waiting for somebody to save us in the same way that when Bernie came out, everybody jumped behind Bernie, all progressives jumped behind Bernie because he was that figure. And now that figure has failed us, we find ourselves in the same position, waiting for someone to save us, not realizing that we have to actually be the change. Because the progressive caucus, they're not going to do squat. They're already Democrats. Even if they're progressive Democrats, they're Democrats within the party. You're not changing that system. You're not changing a beast that was designed to eat you. You know what I'm saying? It's just not going to happen. And the only way it would happen if it did is if they all stood up and made a very loud noise about leaving the Democratic Party publicly in the middle of the upcoming term, something like that. But that's not going to happen. So we have to do the work ourselves, be brave enough to walk away and make a very loud noise when we do it.
Well, Rafe, real quick, let me ask you this. Is there any time in the past where the crowd itself developed, let's say, an identity of one, even though it was a crowd? Meaning, has there ever been a situation where people did stuff without a leader in it? Because I get you, and I feel the same way. Like, if 30 million people just said I'm done, it changes overnight, right? It has to. And I know there are 30 million people who say they want healthcare, and yet that motion just doesn't seem to be able to connect with the reality of events, right? It's like all of these people, you want healthcare, you want Social Security expansion, you want increase in wages. All of those things are dramatically popular. And yet, why do you feel that you're stuck in a quagmire of a system that can't make that connection from what you want as a group and a crowd to get it politically accomplished? And, some of it is the options that are there where people feel like, okay, these are the only avenues of political discourse, and so I'm stuck with one or the other, and I just have to accept it, that type of stuff. But I guess what I'm asking you is there a situation where the crowd has ever just spontaneously did something on its own? Or was there always a necessary need for a leader? And I think, unfortunately, there's always the need for a leader. I'm unaware with the crowd. Like, if you think of Occupy Wall Street, what happened to it? It became this kind of inert thing because it was like, we're just going to be this kind of kumbaya thing. We're not going to have a leader. We're just going to... It fizzled out. It couldn't do anything. It was like inoculated just by its own, the ideology of it all. And again, ideology is a poor substitute for reality. So is there any way for this to take place without that leadership figure?
Actually, when you first proposed the question in my mind, I was like, well, nah, actually. But if you think about it, it happens all the time, actually. So when we do have a leader, when we had Martin Luther King, when we had Malcolm X, those particular faces, those particular personalities, of course, it organizes and guides everyone for the most part in the same direction. But as far as any time in the past where the majority came together and rose and made and inflicted change, it happens quite frequently. As a matter of fact, we just don't see it for what it is. When you see people, when you see riots, when you see large masses of protests growing, coming up and going out, like the Yellow Vests and all these different places where they literally toppled the government, that's what that is. It's just that we don't really like. When you think about it contextually, you don't like what it means for your comfortable living. That's why we don't do it here in the U.S. to that extent. So when but to answer your question, the public rising up and making his voice heard, whether through protests or through toppling the government, that is the mass coming together as one personality or one mind. Be it not an organized, concise mind.
Right there.
Still one mind.
Wait. Stop right there.
Yeah.
Organized, concise mind. Like, it's one thing to have energy expended in 1,000 different places. Let's say you got 1,000, whatever units of energy, and that energy gets frittered all over the place. But I'm talking about an organized, concise, focused force in a direction with a clear intent. And that's different.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen. You're talking about, that's a philosophical argument you're making, or point you're making. It's not going to happen because we have to be a hive mind. That's just not going to happen.
Well, that's kind of my point, though.
I mean,
that's why
it can happen.
The leadership thing. I mean, it's like, I understand this
totally
notion that the
happen.
public rising up is, fair enough. But I guess what I'm getting at is to get things accomplished, there's an organized bit of energy. You can fritter your energy away all over the place. That doesn't necessarily get anything done. I'm talking about something significant. The Yellow Vest movement is a really good example because they did organize like that. They just came almost spontaneously. They weren't led, and they did have this notion of, okay, we want these political councils. So fair enough, you're right. But I don't see that in America. I just don't. I mean, it seems like when something like that gets accomplished, there's a leadership figure that organizes it.
Well, the question is, I mean, you have these. You're talking about Occupy. That was organized for a while. It was distributed across the country. It had a bunch of people for about a year plus who were doing this thing in most major cities around the states. I mean, the problem with leaders is they get outed, and either they're literally killed, in the case of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, or just through various means they get taken out, and the movement that rose up under them sort of dies down. Now, that didn't necessarily happen with the civil rights movement, although definitely without the leadership of either of those figures, it was a lot weaker, I think, than it would have been. But another side of this, I just want to back up for a second. All of the sort of spontaneous organizations of political energy that you're talking about, whether it's the Yellow Vest or talking about Occupy for a minute, you could look at the Black Lives Matter protests this summer and over recent years. All of these, and it's probably inevitable, there's probably something mechanical in the system. They're all oppositions to something. They're all an attempt to change the status quo. They're all sort of polarizing against some situation. In other words, when I'm sort of putting that up, they're not, I'm going to use the word positive, and I don't mean positive in the sort of moral sense of like this is a good thing or a bad thing. They're not pushing for some specific agenda that can then unify people around this is the change we're going to make. This is what we're going to push for in the political system. Am I wrong about that? I mean, they're all, like, in other words, they're all boycotting some current order of things. They're all protesting against some current order of things. But what that means is, if the leader gets,
isn't that true for all?
Well, that's the thing. Is that true for all movements?
I think it is. Because if things are great, why push for to change it?
I hear what you're saying. That's partly technically true, but I'll put it like this. Doesn't that mean that we're always stuck in some old way of seeing things? Because our enmities are as old as our history. And if you look at the technological innovation stuff that we talk about on the air sometimes, those are specific new solutions for problems that don't come from just identifying the problem, but come from like some specific new solution. There's like a positive agenda. There's some concrete new additive proposal that you're putting into the political mix right there. Don't you need something of both? Don't you need an element of both, like an opposition? This is super abstract, non-concrete stuff. But don't you need, some oppositionality as well as some propositionality, some proposal that you're putting forward that's going to solve in a new way the problems that you've identified in the system? Isn't that also necessary? And I think for that, you do need leaders, whether they come before the movement starts or whether the movement elevates them into a position of power. I think you need both. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
Yeah, I think we're stuck. I guess the reason why I asked the question that way was because, we always have this thought of all of these people agree. All of them agree. And many of them are Democrats. They would say, yeah, I think we should have health care. And if you didn't have this back and forth between Sanders and Democrats, they would say, yeah, Medicare for all is fine. They probably would agree. But it's like, how do you get them on the same page? And I don't know how you do it without a leader. But as you said, the leader is the weak point of the movement, right? Like that's the guy who's in charge. That's the guy who your opposition tries to take the head off because it becomes something else. Even if you have a power structure under it, sometimes the leader is such a charismatic figure that it takes them to even energize it forward. And it's like Occupy, like you said, that in the beginning they had organizers to get that stuff in a direction. I agree that a riot is the public rising up. But that's the public rising up in this thrust of energy that dissipates immediately because of how strong it was.
It's a wave.
Yeah,
it's a wave, but waves just dissipate. They come and they go, and that's they're very forceful. They can drag you under, and they can push you up against the rocks, but they're going to fade away. Right. You need a turbine. You need some way to capture that energy.
And that's a leader.
We got a caller though.
Okay, let's go to the caller. But I guess I'm agreeing with you. I think it's funny. Sometimes you pose these situations and I'm like, both of those things are true. It's just like there's no resolution to it. That's the issue, right? It's like reality doesn't give you these resolutions, like talking about. But
it's like you're setting up. You're setting up the dynamics of a system that you've got to work in some way. You got to figure out some solution for. Anyway, Roberto calling in from DC. Roberto, you were on the air. What's on your mind, man?
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. Just very quickly, first of all, your station sounds very poor around town, and I don't know what is that, but maybe you want to work on that.
It comes and it goes.
I'm sorry. The point I want to raise is that the Republicans and everybody else have been pounding the Democratic Party like they have a very serious issue with the plight of immigrants that escaped from socialism. Marco Rubio and former governor of Florida was in Georgia. They were here and there blaming everything in the radical socialist communist manifesto, communist manifesto, and so on and so forth, trying to scare everybody, saying, okay,
Roberto, I'm sorry, mate. It's hard. It's quite hard to hear you. There's a bunch of noise. I'm guessing you're out on a city street. I'm guessing you're in DC or somewhere like that. A quick note. Thank you for the call. A quick note. I just checked this. Usually our stations suffer lower quality in the DC area specifically when the weather is cruddy. And I just did a quick search. I'm not in the area right now, but sure enough, it's raining in DC. I'm not sure if that's what the problem is there, but just noting a correlation that I've noticed in the past. In any event, Roberto, please call back some other time. It was hard to make you out, man. Mainly just because a bunch of noises in the background. Sounds like you're on a busy city street. In any event, we're going to go into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break with Bradley Blankenship. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from the capital, Washington, D.C. Joining us is Bradley Blankenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Bradley, welcome back to the show, man.
Hey, guys.
I always enjoy when you come on because I love these conversations into the politics of China and the history of the country. One of the questions that we've had on this show is basically how has China thrived whereas the Soviet Union collapsed? Meaning post-Soviet Union, there was this idea that the Soviet Union itself was this kind of beacon of socialism and whatnot, and that it was a softer version of things, meaning you kind of had this kind of axis in these two economic systems or political systems in the U.S. versus Soviet Union. Well, one collapses, but China is still considered or still a communist country, and it's thrived in spite of the Soviet Union collapsing. So what were the differences in the system? Why has one been able to thrive, whereas the other, for the most part, succumbed to political and external pressures?
Mm-hmm. So, the last time I was on here, I talked a little bit about that whole management problem, but I'll kind of just summarize that main point. So, basically, the labor and the different quota systems in the Soviet Union were, a lot of them kind of just didn't make sense, and there was a lot of disincentive to actually work extremely hard because, for example, I think one of the biggest differences in China and the Soviet Union is there's a very rich consumer economy in China. People can go out and buy a smartphone or a car or something like this. But in the Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc, if you wanted to get a car, for example, you'd have to wait on a list for 5-10 years sometimes. And so, you kind of have this situation where it's like you have no reason to really work hard in the sense that you have nothing to buy with your money in the first place. So, what's the point of actually working very hard to do that? But more than that, also, there was kind of some arbitrary quotas in agriculture in different factories. The government would set a quota system for different factories. And if you were to meet that quota, they would raise it. So you'd have to work even harder, and you have no incentive to actually do that. So a lot of people would just, not hit their quotas, and they would get government subsidies. So the problem in the Soviet Union was actually not, a lot of people think that it was this totalitarian system. There was so much control over everything. But actually, when it came to the economic situation, the problem was that there was not enough discipline. There was not enough oversight, enough of this kind of managerial discipline. Actually, Raul Castro had mentioned this as a problem in Cuba's agricultural industry. He said, we have this blockade. Obviously, it's affecting our economy, but at the same time, you go to the fields and you just see farm equipment laying around. And one problem that Raul Castro pointed out is they had a system in place for some time in Cuba where, you would have to work certain hours in the week, 30, 40 hours or whatever. And people would just do all of their work in a few days. They'll pull like 2 or 3 12-hour days and then work 4 hours. And the rest of the days they're just not working because they would just, get it all done and not work at all. And then you would have some people doing work for other people and some people taking days off. And so it's just there was just a general kind of lack of discipline in the labor force.
Does this get to this notion of, I like to say ideology makes a poor substitute for reality. I think sometimes the left has this idea that if you can have a society structured where people do things because it's right and in the best interest of the whole, missing the point that no, incentives help. Personal incentives, meaning this kind of, in the same way, in this kind of similar capitalistic incentive that leans heavily on that point. That I can.
There's a really amazing quote, I think, by the former East German defense minister, and he said something like, you should never discount. Or no, he said we thought we were making good people, but it turned out we weren't. And the real idea there is you can never really discount this feeling that people generally have in life of discontent and wanting to have something nicer or, have a better standard of living. I mean, when you have this revolution that takes place in the Soviet Union or, Cuba or some country that's just like heavily oppressed, you have a dictator, a king or something, and there's just so much inequality. The initial revolution, people are very energized. They have this wave of energy, like, yes, we're going to be educated now. We're going to have our healthcare and everything's amazing. But that next generation, when we talked about Belarus, for example, I talked to you guys several times on that topic. And the problem that Lukashenko has is to convince people to buy into the system as it exists in Belarus, that next generation. So that's the problem, is that you have these next generations come and they don't actually see what they have as something gained. They just kind of take it as normal, and then they want to live better. I mean, it's just natural. People want to live better than their parents. They want to have nicer things, something like this. So exactly what you're saying, it's not just like ideological. It's not just capitalist or communist. It's just the reality. This is how people are.
You can also take this a little bit philosophically. You were talking about economic incentives or legal incentives. And by the way, thank you for joining us. You could also take this to a slightly more philosophical level. If you have a country, and it actually weirdly links up with the conversation we were having just before on the other side of this break. If you have a country that is founded on repairing old problems, it has its sort of a motivating political philosophy, trying to fix some previous status quo. And then, like you're saying, a generation later, people are born and, everybody who's young in that country didn't experience the previous status quo that country is trying to fix. and is still trying to fix in some sense, is still founded on trying to fix, you lose like the core. You lose the political, philosophical core, which just is inherently demotivating. Do you see that at all? I mean, you're just kind of talking about that, kind of pointing at that with Belarus. Do you think that would apply to other countries of that ilk?
I think that definitely applies to all these countries. Another thing, I mean, I think this is also another problem with the Soviet Union that they particularly had because, up from 1917, or I guess 1924, in the 20s, when the Soviet Union itself was actually started, but, even the revolution before that, 1917, the entire leadership of the Communist Party and the country basically was ruled under Lenin and Stalin, of course, Stalin for several decades. So these are the original revolutionaries under control of the country for that entire time. And there was a really serious leadership crisis with Stalin, when Khrushchev came to power and so on. But actually, an interesting part of this, particularly that history, actually the Chinese Communist Party put out a really incredible study actually a few years ago about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one interesting point they had, kind of talking about this original system and the original kind of like fixing the problems and so on, is that they had a really interesting insight that when they went through the de-Stalinization period, when they disavowed Stalin, the Communist Party said, yeah, everything that happened in that period was wrong, it was bad. And they Stalin had the mausoleum next to Lenin. They got rid of it. They changed all the street names. They actually, in Prague, there was a massive Stalin statue. They blew it up. You create a kind of idea that, the foundation of the country itself is wrong. Because Stalin had built the Soviet Union. I mean, Lenin was the ideological force, but he died so early into it that Stalin was the person that built the first socialist country. He built the first socialist economy. He was the revolutionary leader of the Soviet Union. When the Communist Party in Russia disavowed him, that opened the door to say, yeah, the whole thing is wrong. You know what I mean? It was this is exactly why, for example, the United States never disavows the founding fathers. Liberals in the United States, the farthest they'll go is say, yeah, there was some mistakes made, but they won't disavow the founding fathers and say, yeah, they were, racist, slave owners, and so on.
We're getting close.
Can't do that. We're getting close
this summer. Yeah, we're taking down the statues.
The reason why they can't do that is particularly because when you do that, it would destabilize the United States. This is why China, even though it did have a reform program, they have never disavowed Chairman Mao. I mean, he's still on the currency. He still has pictures up. They still talk about him. And it's for this reason, because they would see it as...
This gets to where I wanted to go. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I'll let you come back to it in just a second. Real quick, I actually have a very quick follow-up question. You mentioned the study that the Chinese Communist Party wrote or published about the transition of power from Stalin to Khrushchev. Just so I can add this to my reading list, where can I find that study real quick?
I'll have to find it for you because it was pretty difficult for me to find myself, but I have it on a Google Drive, so I can send it to you. I don't know what the name of it is.
Thank you. No, I'll follow up after the fact. I'm curious about this stuff, and I'll just briefly note there's a paucity of information, a paucity specifically of translations. We lack translations of Chinese Communist Party text in America, and I say this not as somebody on the left, but simply as somebody who's interested in understanding countries in general, let alone this major international growing force. In any event, I want to get back to this conversation. From that study and broadly from what you've seen, and this sort of ties into what you're saying, what lessons do you think the Chinese Communist Party has learned? The Chinese state has learned? What lessons do you see Xi Jinping implementing when they look back at the Soviet Union, when they look back at this other example of a prominent and for a time a very successful socialist state? How do you see them differing intentionally from the Soviets?
I think the biggest thing they learned was about the leadership, because when Stalin died, there was this leadership vacuum. And people were really disagreed about the direction of the country. Some people were like, we can't, we have to open up more. We have to liberalize in some way. And they kind of had no idea how to actually do that. And especially in the 70s and 80s, they totally could not do it gracefully. I mean, it was a disaster. I think one of the different animating factors between Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism as applied to China through Mao is that even Mao Zedong thought really kind of, in a way, created a system where it was not just following the leader's words, and creating this kind of sense of fear, but it was really about empowering people to kind of do it themselves, to adopt this. There was really this belief in Mao Zedong thought that if the Communist Party ever screws up, the people should be the one to hold them to account. And that actually happened on several different occasions. And, everything that happened in China through the 60s and 70s and all that, a lot of that was led by people on the streets. I mean, it wasn't even the government per se or government agencies. It was people on the street. So there was kind of this, and by the way, this still persists. I mean, the social media, Chinese social media, people on social media, activists, so on, really do in many ways hold the government to account. Actually, with the whole coronavirus situation, this played out in various situations. Actually, the one controversial doctor everybody was talking about that was silenced or so on, and he was given court papers and so on by the police and basically told to shut up. He was actually vindicated in a court of law in China after so many people, social media users in China, had actually blasted the government over this. So there really is kind of this accountability wave that Mao had kind of instilled into China, whereas in the Soviet Union, there's really a culture of fear, like you have to follow what Stalin says or something can happen to you. But in China,
That's
it's very much, it's very, I would say, sorry, go ahead.
No, pardon me. When I think of China, I think of the whole 100 flowers thing and the idea that you let the flowers bloom before you cull them. I mean, when I think of Mao Zedong, that's what I think of. And it's not a pretty picture. It's sort of, we got to go into a break. I don't mean to leave us on that note, but I will. We're going into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, talking right now with Bradley Blankenship about China and the Soviet Union. We'll be back with Bradley in just a minute. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Blankenship. We're joined now by Bradley Blankenship. He is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Also, you should go check him out on Twitter. It is his username on Twitter, _. So the words Brad, blank, and then the character _ on Twitter. Bradley, thank you again for being with us. I kind of took us out on a slightly, just an interesting, right, a weird kind of oblique note, talking about the 100 flowers thing. You were talking about how China, unlike the Soviet Union, had sort of liberalized not just its economy, but also the ability of the public to criticize and to engage in various forms of dissent against the government. You were saying that this, in some sense, started out with Mao Zedong. What I've heard about Mao Zedong, and again, this is coming from a fairly sort of Western, admittedly imperialist narrative. I admit that I've been propagandized on this stuff. Please unpropagandize me. What I've heard about Mao Zedong is he engaged in the 100 flowers movement, let these flowers bloom, let this sort of wave of artistic criticism grow, and then cut those flowers down, so to speak, engaged in this, this attempt to excise forms of dissent and criticism by the public. But what's the reality here? What's your take, Bradley?
Well, actually, something that's particularly interesting as well about China, I don't know if you guys knew this, but the last emperor of China, or the last king of China, actually, whereas, for example, the Soviets killed the Romanovs, like massacred them, in the Russian Revolution. But in China, actually, the last king of China, he had defected to Japan during the war and so on, and he came to China. I think he was in Nanjing. He was arrested by the Soviets, who held him in a prison camp. Mao Zedong had personally levied to get him back. He came to China, and he met personally with Mao Zedong, and he told him, look, I'm going to make you like the shining example of what rehabilitation looks like. We're not going to kill you, imprison you, whatever. And he got a street home in Beijing and worked as a street cleaner and also a tour guide in his former palace that he lived in his whole life. And so in some ways, I feel like that really encapsulates actually what it was about. I mean, the program, we hear all the time it was super brutal. And yeah, for sure, definitely in some ways it was. And there was definitely a lot of mistakes made under Mao. That's why China's not the same as it was before. There's a lot of good things that happened after the fact. But always at the core, there was, this idea that you can criticize the party and the working class should be, the leader of the party, not the other way around. The party is leading the working class. So there was always a lot of dissent. There was always a lot of, and also activists leading in the struggle. But also, I mentioned the story of the last king of China, because there was also the idea that people can be rehabilitated. You don't just give up on people. People can, through discourse, come to new understandings. Actually, this man had written a book called The Last King of China, and it talked about how he endorsed the Chinese Communist Party and the system and was just really baffled by how great it was, actually. And he did tons of media rounds about this. Actually, I don't know if you guys know this, the history of even Xi Jinping. His father was basically excommunicated from the Communist Party, exiled, and actually Xi Jinping grew up as a farmer, and he tried to join the Communist Party. I think it was 8 or 9 times. He failed every time and eventually had made it in.
That is very interesting. No, I didn't know that.
Interesting. Wow. And I do have to be honest, it is kind of brutal to be the king and then go to basically a tour guide of your palace.
Sweeping the streets.
Yeah, right. And cleaning streets. There's something, let's say, punitive about that in a strange way, in an odd way. Even almost something descriptive. This notion that this guy was the king of this particular country with a particular political system, and this idea of workers and this guy now being put into this lowly distribution. I don't know. It just seems like there was something that was tried, they were trying to impart. I do want to get into something else. The notion of, like you were making the point of saying how not the failure to uphold Stalin led to the collapse of USSR, and China wouldn't necessarily repudiate Mao in this process despite the mistakes made. The mistakes that were made, I want to get into that for a moment. The countries, the Soviet Union, and for that matter, China, were at war. And they were at constant war by countries like in the West that wanted to basically destroy it from its inception. I mean, people don't forget this, but we had Western armies invade the USSR trying to put the Red Army or trying to put the White Army back in charge or trying to put basically the Tsar back in power. And so, not to mention, they've been invaded by the West like 3 times with 40 million people dead in the process of those wars. So they get a little dicey about their borders. I guess I'm trying to get to this notion, though, that the country was always at war. Like, there was never a point where there wasn't this kind of political pressure that was against it to try to undermine it and put back in a different political system. How far or how much did that have to do with the, let's say, the organization of the government and the things that the government did itself to retain this kind of power?
Right. This is tricky because, of course, there's no doubt at all that that this created, the historical conditions which led to the Soviet system and why it was especially under Stalin, so brutal and so on. And why there, for example, Michael Parenti has a really great quote. He says, if there was no CIA, there would not have been a KGB. And it's true. I mean, there's nothing in the doctrine of Marxism-Leninism that says, yes, we have to, divert all our resources to the military. And the fact that the Soviets had to maintain military parity with the West really dampened a lot of the social programs that they wanted to develop. And I have no doubt that if that wouldn't have happened, things would have been a lot different. But I think you have to be careful here because not all of the mistakes can be owed to, that particularly. For example, the forced relocations of peoples. And I think this is actually Vladimir Putin had a very good point about this national question. Actually, this was Stalin's main contribution, I think, to Marxism-Leninism, which was the national question, what to do about these different nationalities in Russia, because the Russian Empire, they had kind of seen the Russian Empire as the graveyard of civilizations. Everybody was Russified, taught Russian language, cultures were suppressed under the Tsar, things were illegal. And interestingly, this is why Finland became independent after the war. And Stalin had actually given a speech to Finland's Congress when they voted, to basically be a liberal democracy. They didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union. And he said, I promised you guys, part of my doctrine, or as part of the Soviet doctrine, that I would, respect your decision to not be a part of the Soviet Union, and that's fine. You chose your way. That's whatever. We'll still have good relations and so on. But the way that they had done this, Putin said, they just kind of drew arbitrary lines, and we're still seeing the problems of that. The fact that so many lines were drawn arbitrarily, like in Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, that's Stalin kind of just like drew that line, and of course now we're still dealing with that problem, right? After the Soviet collapse. But the forced relocation of people even before the war, I was actually debating this with somebody recently. They said, well, they had to do that, relocate, especially the Germans that were living in Eastern Europe on the border, because they were sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Maybe the Crimean Tatars and other people, they were like sympathetic to the Nazis or collaborating and so on. They had to relocate them to Siberia because, you got to take them away from the front. They're going to collaborate. But this was going on well before the war and well after the war. It was not just because of this. I mean, certainly it was accelerated. And in that particular position, I mean, it's a very crude way of dealing with that issue. But, you got to do what you got to do. It's a war. But let's look at how China's dealing with that national question, right? In Xinjiang, for example, with the Uyghurs. There is no doubt that the CIA, the fact that the CIA is operating in Afghanistan, we already know that. And they're using implants in Xinjiang to try to destabilize China. If they were going to follow the Soviet Union, they would just relocate all the Uyghurs out of that area on their border, because this could be a destabilizing effort. They're doing the exact opposite. They're investing in those communities, providing people with jobs and education and so on. And their official doctrine is that, we de-radicalize people, or we convince people to be a part of our country by investing in them and including them, instead of treating them as others and deporting them to different parts of the country. So again, I think this is another important question about that siege socialism mentality, and China does not have that. It just so happens that siege has to be lifted at some point for people to be happy,
That's interesting. What do you, real quick, what are you talking about with the siege mentality there? You're talking about the sort of long-term sort of enmity with a certain part of the population?
Well, the siege, they kind of just, the Soviet Union locked it down. They locked everything down. They locked their borders. People couldn't travel at all, really. That's why if you go to the Eastern Bloc in Russia, particularly, you'll see that people have what are called dachas, which are little summer homes. So the government gave everybody a summer home because they couldn't travel abroad or go different places. So they said, okay, well, we'll get you a cabin in the woods and you can chill in the summer. And there was like a siege, they couldn't trade with the West. They couldn't have any consumer goods. They were just building up their military for a war that never happened. And all of those resources ended up, being diverted away from the social programs. And I understand that they had to do this because they were at a constant war, but that war never came and nobody ever wanted it. China, they do have a strong military now, but for so long they really didn't. And that war with the West that never came, So they didn't particularly have this same siege mentality that the Soviets had.
I hear you. No, that's very interesting. We've got about 2 minutes left, really about a minute and a half. And I'm curious, I'll just keep this quick. Confucius thought, I believe we spoke with this the last time you were on the show. How is the history of Confucianism been received over the past, say, four decades? What's the current standing of Confucianism in the Chinese Communist Party and in China as a whole, Bradley?
Well, I actually don't know if it's real relation in the Communist Party at this point, but it's obviously very important in China. They're opening Confucius Institutes all over the world now as kind of a cultural exchange program. So obviously there is a lot of importance. Actually, we have one here in Prague. I think my friend, there's one in Mexico City, my buddy that lives there. I don't know if there's any in the United States. the U.S. government's been cracking down on them, calling them like intelligence spronts or something. But anyways, I think that, this idea is very present. I mean, the Chinese have a very different idea of governance than us. Whereas in the United States and the West, we have a combativeness towards the government. We see our rights as inalienable and separate from the government. One rights are here and the government can't trample on it. And, we're kind of antagonistic to our own government. But in China, it has always been that the state is like guarantees the welfare of people. It's there to protect people. They understand that rights are meaningless without, some protections, right? So they kind of see the state as part of their family in a way. And I think in some ways it kind of relates to the Confucianist philosophy. There's kind of a connection there, in this idea of statecraft and how the state relates to people. It's very much different than the way that we can kind of visualize these things.
I can set shells of responsibility or different layers of responsibility and interesting stuff. You know what? Let's talk about that more some other time. That was the voice of Bradley Blankenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Also check him out on Twitter at @BradBlank_. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show. That's the one you're currently listening to, covering news and events across those states as well as across our divided globe. And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
You're up there with torches peering off into the gloomy dark, and you're listening to us, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Without further ado, let's get into the news this morning. In the headlines on this Tuesday, December 1st of 2020, at least 1,265 new coronavirus deaths and 167,756 new cases were reported in the United States on November 30th. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 160,387 new cases per day, an increase of 3% from the average 2 weeks earlier. This as we're headed into cold and flu season. I'm just going to point this out. Last week we had some, I believe it was early last week, 2,000 deaths per days. So some sort of very, very steep deaths from the coronavirus attributed to the coronavirus. That's the steepest that we'd seen since, what was it, like April? Maybe more like, I'm pretty sure it was April. A long time ago at this point. Heading back into cold and flu season. And at least as of now, as of this Tuesday, again, is over the weekend. Weekend usually reporting is a bit slower. As of now, it's gone back down. We'll see if the Thanksgiving travel, which was much bruited in the media as potentially causing another spike, we'll see if that actually does cause another spike. Likely it will. To what extent that kills people remains to be seen. And hopefully that extent is a low one anyway. That's a bit of a tongue twister, that sentence there. The governors of Iowa and North Dakota have ordered residents to wear masks. State leaders have imposed curfews in Ohio and in most of California. In an interview with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said Monday that the majority of Americans who wish to get vaccinated for the novel coronavirus should be able to by this coming April or May. I'm going to quote from him. This is again in an interview with Zuckerberg on Facebook. Quote, so right now the federal government has contracted with multiple companies to make about 600 million doses of vaccine, which would be good enough for around 300 million people getting vaccinated. Hence, everyone that you would imagine that would want to get vaccinated in the country would have a vaccine. And As we get into January, the next year, February, then March, by the time we get to April, we would likely have taken care of all the high priority and then the general population. A normal, healthy young man or woman, 30 years old, that has no underlying conditions, can walk into a CVS or to a Walgreens and get vaccinated, end quote. If that happens, that will mean that by summer at the latest, if holding that true, assuming that the vaccine works, by summer at the latest, you'll have some semblance of normalcy, I think, returning again to America. Jamarl, if just assuming for a second that holds true, and that is admittedly a big if, how do you think that's going to affect us? Should we expect things to go back to, non-lockdown status by this coming summer? Or what do you think would happen? Again, assuming that's true.
So that's interesting, right? If the vaccine works and people don't become zombies because of some kind of, mutation that people couldn't find, this thing got done in a year. Then yeah, I suppose on some level, people will go back to whatever normal is. Look, personally, I don't think there is a normal. I think these things are changing constantly. And whether maybe people go back to school, maybe not. Maybe people start shopping more from the standpoint of going to grocery stores, or maybe they enjoy having things delivered to their house. Maybe workers decide, well, wait a minute, beforehand you told me I couldn't work from home because the company will fall apart, and we've been working from home for the last 8 months. How do you justify not allowing me to do this where I can have more family time? Meaning things may change just because of the way our lives change from COVID. And there are some of those things that people may actually enjoy. And so, going back to normal, it depends. I don't know if we're going back to normal in the way things were before COVID. I do think there will be adjustments that will be made just because people enjoy some of those adjustments. Working from home, maybe one of them. Shopping from home, maybe one of them. So I could be wrong, but we'll see.
If Joe Biden puts on blackface, it'll almost be like it's 2014 again tomorrow. Wouldn't that be nice? No. We need to get back into headlines. Next headline here. The Alphabet-owned AI research company DeepMind has developed a piece of AI software called AlphaFold that can accurately predict the structure that proteins will fold into. It can do this in a matter of days. It's a major advance. The latest version of AlphaFold has been recognized as a solution to a long-standing challenge by the organizers of the biennial meeting group known as CASP. That stands for Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction. It's a community experiment organization with the mission of accelerating solutions to one problem. It's about 50 years old. How to compute the 3D structure of protein molecules. That problem, known as the protein folding problem, has stood as a grand challenge in biology. On Monday, the group said that DeepMind's AlphaFold system had achieved unparalleled levels of accuracy in its prediction. The idea here is proteins are essential to life. They support practically all of its functions, and they are large and complex molecules. They're made of chains of amino acids. What a protein does largely depends on its unique 3D structure. But if you're just looking at the amino acids themselves, the sort of 2D chain of these things, it's very hard to predict what that 3D structure is going to look like. That, of course, is where this whole AlphaFold thing comes in, because apparently it's better than any of its predecessors, as far as I can tell. We'll be talking more about this with a guest tomorrow. Better than any of its predecessors at predicting that 3D structure. And if this is just the beginning, then, well, this is just the beginning. It'll be getting better as time goes on. What this forebodes, what this implies about the development of the biosciences over coming years or decades, that's an open question in my book. Not an expert by any means, but we'll see. And nevertheless, just if you step away from the medical perspective or the biological perspective, the scientific perspective for a second, this is a big advance for AI as a whole, particularly because, a lot of folks were looking at the rise of technology, the rise of new technologies and what they would mean, where to invest, where our society is going, where the brightest minds and most profitable opportunities for those minds to go work. They were looking in large part at AI and at the biological sciences, like biotechnology, and, post CRISPR, post the mapping of the human genome, all these different ways of manipulating our source code, so to speak. Well, if you combine the two, if this is a sort of one way of looking at this, and I don't think we've talked about during the show so far, if this makes it more palpable to biological scientists that AI is useful, well, in some sense, you're probably going to see a lot more companies popping up in this space. You're probably going to be seeing a lot more credibility lended to research operating in this space by AI applied to the biological sciences. And that, I'm just pointing that out. It's going to be a trend to watch. You probably didn't hear it here first, but you definitely heard it here. Anyway, In our next headline, the United Nations appealed Tuesday for a record $35 billion to provide humanitarian support for 160 million people next year. This is as the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic has pushed millions into extreme poverty worldwide. According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quote, conflict, climate change, and COVID-19 have created the greatest humanitarian challenge since the Second World War, end quote. The UN says that some 235 million people, or 1 in every 33 people on the planet, requires aid or protection. This is a 40% increase over 2020. Meanwhile, in China, the country has put into effect Tuesday a new export control law that allows it to block shipments to foreign companies for national security reasons. This kind of reminds me, and should remind you, of course, of what the Trump administration has been doing with Huawei, among other Chinese companies. While no product list has been published so far, some observers say that rare earth metals, more than 60% of which are produced in China, are likely among those to face export curbs. Should Beijing, for instance, blacklist an American company in response to pressure from Washington on, for instance, Huawei Technologies, it could also retaliate, Beijing that is, against other companies complying with U.S. sanctions against the Chinese company. So this sort of just allows them to control what they're able to export, and increases the powers of the state in using its economy as a political tool internationally. The authorities, again, as of yesterday, had provided a little detail on what products or companies would be subject to the new restrictions. A court in The Hague, and that's the Netherlands for folks, will hear claims that Royal Dutch Shell has broken Dutch law by knowingly hampering the global phase-out of fossil fuels. This is a case that could force that company to reduce its CO2 emissions, probably dramatically changing its corporate structure and what industries it's in, or at least how it's making its money in those industries. Lawyers for a consortium led by Friends of the Earth Netherlands will argue on the first of 4 days of public hearings on Tuesday that Shell has been aware for decades of the damage it has inflicted and is acting unlawfully by expanding its fossil fuel operations. Last year, the Dutch Supreme Court upheld a groundbreaking 2015 ruling ordering the Netherlands government to do much more to cut carbon emissions following a legal battle pursued by the nonprofit Urgenda Foundation on similar grounds. A Shell spokesman said the company agreed with the plaintiffs that the climate crisis needed to be tackled, but added that legal challenges would not speed up the move to renewables. In Iran, lawmakers on Tuesday ratified the general outlines of a national plan to boost nuclear activity in the wake of the recent assassination of Iranian nuclear physicist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. It's according to the Mehr news agency. The general outlines of the interactive plan for the lifting of sanctions were passed with 248 votes in favor. And a quote here from the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission spokesman, quote, the nuclear program should proceed according to the needs of the country, and we expect it to be strengthened after this move. And the aim of the plan is to counter the sanctions imposed on the Iranian people by American and Western countries, end quote. And by the way, earlier this year, if you remember, this year was practically kicked off with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force. More recently, over the weekend, specifically, this nuclear physicist was assassinated. And then it's also coming out, our caller, Tarif, thank you for the call. Thank you for the heads up on this one. It's also coming out that on either Saturday or Sunday, Iraqi security and local militia officials said yesterday that an airstrike had killed a commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guards at the Iraq-Syria border. So this was it was a drone strike. It seems to have taken place on either Saturday or Sunday. News of it came out yesterday. So a string of assassinations at this point in this year. Just pointing that out for folks watching global conflict brewing and watching specifically what potentially Israel, potentially the U.S. working in cahoots seem to be doing to kick up conflict. In somewhat related, in completely unrelated news, I don't know why I'm saying somewhat related news. In completely unrelated news, back to the U.S., FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has announced that he's leaving the commission as of January 20th, 2021. That's the same day that President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in. It's not a major surprise. Appointees often resign with a new administration. For instance, former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler did the same when Trump took over back in 2016. Pai will be remembered by many for his decision to strip net neutrality protections that were in place under the Obama presidency. The FCC voted along party lines in late 2017 to remove the Title II classification for broadband service, which then allowed internet service providers to practice blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization as long as they disclosed those practices. It is not yet clear who will take over at the FCC, but it's entirely possible that a new chairperson under the Biden administration will work to bring back net neutrality protections. That is hopeful sounding, at least. Whether or not these come from, once again, classifying broadband under Title II remains to be seen. But this would be another one of those sort of pendulum swings in our political system where somebody that Biden appoints potentially tries to put those rules back into place. In any event.
Wait, Shane, just to interject real quick. If I'm not mistaken, Obama put IG Pai in a position in the first place. Donald Trump moved him into the position where he basically nuked net neutrality. But let's be clear, if I am not mistaken, he was Obama's pick. And Obama put him in there in the first place.
No, I don't believe that's the case. Ajit Pai stepped in 2017. So I believe he was one of the administration's picks.
Yes, but Obama put him in where he was, at the very least, in the board, meaning he stepped into a position of authority. But Trump didn't put him into the, what's the word I'm looking for? The name of the organization itself. Meaning, yes.
FCC chairman.
Right. The chairman position himself was a spot that Trump put him in, but Obama was the one who put him into prominence.
You're saying that Obama brought him into the FCC,
yes.
And Trump appointed him as the chairman of the FCC. So Obama brought him in. He let the wolf into the or the fox into the hen house, so to speak.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Trump's the one who actually let him eat the chickens.
Yes, but the question becomes: is Joe Biden, who's running for a third Obama term, going to do anything about it, considering Obama was the guy who put him in the FCC in the first place?
I hear you. Yeah.
So we'll see, maybe.
One last quick headline here. Facebook is set to begin paying UK news publishers for stories. Facebook's dedicated news tab, which was first seen in the US, will launch in the UK with a promise to pay UK news sites to license articles. This will be arriving next month in January 2021 with partner sites including The Guardian, The Economist, and The Mirror, along with lifestyle sites owned by Condé Nast, Hearst, and others. The company hopes to match its success in the U.S., where it's found that, quote, more than 95% of the traffic Facebook News delivers to publishers is new audiences that have not interacted with those news outlets in the past, quote, end quote. I'll just point this out. I'll close out the headlines. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Real quick note here. I just want to point this out again. Social media, specifically Facebook above all else, reigns above Twitter and the sort of social media battleground here. Facebook not just suppressing stories that it's supposed to have us not like or not read, suppressing quote unquote fake news, not just labeling state-run media outlets, not just doing various sorts of like labeling and suppression, now also working with private companies to push certain outlets, certain stories, certain narratives. I'm just pointing out, the companies that are supposed to mediate our society increasingly also mediate the information we share and read, and frankly are given access to. Just a litmus check. That's where we are as a society. That's where things are going. Now moving into the UK as well. Don't mean to make too much of it. In any event, we've got to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute with Michael Maloof.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Maloof. We are joined by Michael Maloof, former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, also an author and a regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He comes to us with nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. DoD. That's the Department of Defense. Michael, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. All right, talking about a couple of assassinations took place over the weekend. over the holiday weekend specifically in Iran. One, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, noted what various Israeli, specifically intelligence analysts, are calling Iran's top nuclear physicist, top nuclear scientist. And then also, don't know the name of the guy at this point, but we had a caller call in earlier this morning, tip us off to this story. It was reported that one of the commanders of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps at the Iraq-Syria border was also killed in a drone strike. So again, a couple of assassinations of apparently key officials in a few different parts of Iran's national security establishment took place this weekend. What should we make of this? Let's just start off right there. What's actually going on behind the scenes in the relevant national security establishments, Michael?
Well, this is an intensification, purposeful intensification by Israel, given the trying to take advantage of the time period between now and January 20th, while Trump is still in office, to take full advantage. And it's basically death by 1,000 cuts on Iran, short of actual attack on on Iran's nuclear facilities. Although I wouldn't rule that out in the near future. And even under, and you can see that what Netanyahu is attempting to do is trying to pull the U.S. into the fight, but Israel historically has had a tendency to lure other folks and be a provocator just to get other folks involved and to do the fighting for them. And this is what we're seeing here. And because Trump doesn't want to start a war, because he does have an administration where there was no war for a change that he started. Let's put it that way. It's almost going to be the case come after January the 20th. I see that Netanyahu feels that he's not going to be able to get his way with Biden, so that's why he's going to try and take advantage of this time period to make it so bad that even Biden will not be able to do anything worthwhile with Iran, such as trying to renew any Iran nuclear agreement or any derivation thereof. And we've already heard the Iranians say that they have no desire to work with the incoming administration, first of all. And frankly, I don't blame them, because they can make agreements, but another administration come in and break them. Unless it's approved by the Senate as a treaty as opposed to an agreement, the administration, as Trump demonstrated back in May 2018, can just break agreements willy-nilly, and this has really cast a pall on our ability to work with other countries generally, and live up to and take us at our word to live up to commitments. So. From the Iranian perspective, I think they're going to be very leery of wanting to deal with the incoming Biden administration, and I also think that the incoming Biden administration is just going to recreate the problems we had back during the Obama years, as one of your folks said, that this is going to be Obama 3.0, and. It's going to probably be worse than that. Number one, Biden administration is going to insist upon a human rights, democracy policy perspective, and that's not going to bode well with the Saudis, for example. And Trump has worked very hard to try to get the Saudis and the Israelis to work together. And that could be blown out of the water. And that could actually be the beginning of the end of any further so-called normalization in the Middle East with other countries, because Saudi Arabia will just renege, and the other GCC countries will be following the Saudi lead in that respect. As far as Israel is concerned, that the so-called normalization process has helped Israel with respect to setting up bases, particularly in UAE and possibly in Azerbaijan as a result of backing Azerbaijan in their battle over Nagorno-Karabakh. That will then give Israel forward positions for force projection to undertake and initiate any action that they may want to undertake against Iran in the future. They're going to basically, U.S. policy, even under Trump, has been to begin to give Israel the mantle of the security to oversee security in the Middle East as the U.S. begins to recede a little bit. That could be reversed, but under Biden. But I think under Biden, it's going to be very, very difficult because we're going to be seeing the old policies, a redux, if you will, of the old policies, which were failures and brought in Trump in the first place.
Michael, welcome to the show. I always appreciate when you come on. I always appreciate your perspective. I think two things: the Israel getting its associations with various countries in the Middle East, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia behind the scenes, that also legitimizes their dominance in regards to the Palestinian question. Because it creates this thing where these countries, where the populations were against Israel for basically the stealing and theft of the land, the open-air ghetto that the Palestinians are inhabiting. Well, it seems that the governments of those countries are now taking a perspective of that seems to matter less politically.
Yeah.
On the secondary point, and I want to make one secondary point, the provocation. In politics or in war, this tit-for-tat issue comes up, where one country does something, the other country is forced to respond in order to get across that the country can't just use force unilaterally without a consequence. The consequence in this case, though, if there's a response by Iran, pulls the U.S. into a larger engagement, meaning Israel's answer or the actions that they're taking here politically makes sense. You want to have the U.S. to, fight to the last. Israel is willing to fight to the last dead American, basically. And so if you can do this, and if you know that Iran can't entirely respond, even though they're forced to respond, any response gets a provocation or pulled by the U.S. So the politics of war kind of asserts itself here, where the U.S. gets yanked into a conflict because Israel is basically killing Iranians or people pertaining to Iran, in which case when Iran responds, America acts. So it's like this is a quagmire that the U.S. gets itself involved in because of its behavior and tenor towards Iran. Not to mention, when the new administration comes in, even if Biden did want to do something that was conciliatory, it may not be allowed if Iran responds because of the provocations for Israel. This seems to be a political quagmire. How does one extricate itself from it? Or is there an extrication of themselves from it? It's just has to play out in the way it plays out.
Well, with the incoming Biden administration, there will be no way, because if you look at the national security team and the principles that are going to be in his administration, they're all basically very pro-Israeli, and it's going to be they're going to even though they will have some policy differences, such as Biden will have over the settlements issue. He clearly does not want Israel to annex and or actually set up new settlements. But but he may have to give in on that as well, and it's just going to but it's not going to temper very well with. For the Biden administration, if Netanyahu continues for as long as Netanyahu is in office, and that appears to be the case for some time to come, given the internal politics there. So it's for the Palestinians, it's almost it is a no-win. The Saudis have said that they would only go along with normalization if. They went back. If Israel went back to the 67 line and stopped all settlements and agreed to the two-party state, so we don't see that happening either. So, although the Saudis did acquiesce with Bahrain and UAE and normalizing, but that's not yet the Saudis. So, and and it's becoming increasingly apparent that it was the Saudis and the Israelis and Pompeo who, when they met so-called secretly in Saudi Arabia, were in fact talking about Iran and planning the strike. So we're going to be seeing many more of these strikes coming. Again, as I said, it's going to be death by 1,000 cuts. And I think the Iranians will pick and choose their targets. They will be very, very careful, and they need to get their own proxies and what have you in line in order to deal with what could be a major onslaught, which will not be limited in scope, but could include Lebanon and throughout the Middle East, frankly, and also it will upset whatever designs and stability that I put that in quotes in Syria. That Russia has been able to bring to Syria, and because of the slopover effect of war, as we saw back in 2003 when we invaded Iraq, and it definitely had an impact on Syria. So it's a muddled mess. It's going to remain that way, and I don't see how you extricate yourself, particularly in the next 4 years under this thing. We're going to see, particularly when the Biden administration adheres to policy imperatives of adherence to our way of thinking toward human rights and democracy. Although it works for us, it may not. It certainly is not in the culture of these other countries. And for us to impose our democracy and concepts, it's just ludicrous. And we're gonna see within the Biden administration more of the neocons playing a major role, and we're also going to see it being rather anti-Russian. And this is going to have an impact on what happens in the Middle East and elsewhere.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because all of the impetus, all of the strength from the Democratic Party has gone in this mindset that Russia was the reason that Hillary Clinton lost. And despite this being a large psyop, Democrats with no paradigm of the world to understand how that woman could lose the race still believe it, despite the lawsuits and everything else that shows these guys were wrong.
They believe their own propaganda. They began to believe their own propaganda. It was created by the Democratic National Committee.
Exactly. So let's do this. Let's take a break real quick because we're pushing the half hour. But this is Michael Maloof, former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author and regular contributing analyst to RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. And honestly, I came across you in RT, I believe, Rick Sanchez, and you were one of my favorite commentators. So I am so glad you're on the show today. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars. Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate. No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary. I see what you did there. Yep. Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320. And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest, Michael Maloof. He's a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's also an author, and he's a regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. And he has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. We're talking about Iran and generally regional politics in the last segment. I actually want to come back. You're talking about Israel within the last couple of months. A number of nations, specifically Bahrain, UAE, and Sudan, have normalized relations with Israel. And one of the big ones, of course, you're talking about it in the last segment, Saudi Arabia. Their hill on this, the line that they say that Israel has to cross, is ending their settlements, going back to, like you were saying, the 1967 borders. Why is that? I want to come back to Iran in a minute, but for Saudi Arabia, what is the strategic benefit to them? What is their incentive? Why do you think they're choosing that as their bargaining
as
point?
Their baseline? Well,
exactly.
That was something that they came up with under King Abdullah, and they've adhered to that. I forget the exact name of it, but it was an agreement that they reached among the GCC countries, but as it applied to the Palestinian people at a time when Palestine was and the Palestinian people still were a priority policy for them, even though as a practical matter, they didn't do crap for them. They never helped them out of the ghettos that were spawned in Jordan and Lebanon. And I have visited a number of them in Lebanon, particularly, and they're just horrendous and overcrowded. So they really did. They only voiced. They only mouth support. They didn't provide actual support and or financial assistance of any kind. So it was just a pipe dream, and they led the Palestinians down. I mean, they still are just as bad as the people that are openly against the Palestinians for any lack of support. And it's a crying shame what we're seeing. And even within those countries, particularly Lebanon, they have no rights. The Palestinians have no rights. They're not allowed basic rights by law. And this is just outrageous. And I and a few others have worked in the past to try and get that change in their parliament, and it just fell on deaf ears for political reasons. So it's when you look at the internal politics of dealing with the Palestinian issue, even in these Arab-speaking countries, it's atrocious. So so paying lip service to that. And finally, bin Salman said, that's really not our top priority any longer. But he's not going to make a major move unless and until his father dies, because the dad, the father, still believes in that approach with the Palestinians. And I guess out of respect, he's not going to make any major decisions until the king passes away. So but at the same time, you have the Saudis and the Israelis basically forming an unwritten alliance, and that's what we're seeing emerge today. It's been quiet for at least 2 or 3 years, but now it's beginning to surface, and we're seeing it firsthand. The Israelis and the Saudis have been talking for quite some time.
Michael, I want to make a hard pivot to Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashtian somehow is trying to stay in office. I don't know how. The level of hatred that is for that man and Armenia at this point seems like just boiling over. And I am curious here about, what did Russia know and when did they know it? Now, I'm talking about a fine degree of politics. It was understood that let's say Armenia was trending to the west to some degree. It was understood that Azerbaijan was using oil money, not to mention associations with Turkey, to basically increase their military effectiveness, not to mention getting weapons apparently from Israel. And so there's some kind of dodgy, murky relationship there. But basically, Russia knows all of this. And so when this conflict heats up and pops off, and they're trying to be peacemaker in this, is it one of those things where they allowed a certain degree of float, meaning allowed Armenia to understand, look, this is basically where your fortunes lie, despite the fact that you might be showing a little leg to the west? What did they know? Because at the end of all of this, Russia ended up with far more of a presence in this particular area. Mm-hmm. And it's also very clear now from the standpoint of Armenia and Azerbaijan that the West is not where their fortunes lie. Not to mention, they were able to do this without alienating either country. That's why the politics of this was fascinating to me. Can you, what did they know and when did they know it? And was it one of those things where this was to some degree, I don't want to say planned, but more so the politics of it was understood that it was going to trend towards this outcome?
Well, I think the trend emerged. I think Moscow was perplexed over what to do initially because it does have very close relations with both countries, both Azerbaijan and Armenia. Putin, however, really doesn't particularly care for the Armenian prime minister, because he jailed his predecessor, who was very close to Putin. But at the same time, Russia has a base 102 in Armenia, and what I think Moscow was attempting to do was try to bring together these two countries to come to to stop the conflict, and it was initiated by Azerbaijan, I think, at the instigation of Turkey. So, because Turkey has its own designs in the region to regain its Turkic influence back in the Caucasus, South Caucasus, and they're succeeding. And it also created problems for Iran because a lot of Iran has a lot of Azerbaijani expatriates. So it was really a dilemma, I think, not only for Iran, but also for Russia. And this is why Russia decided to take the peacekeeping approach to get the two sides to stop and actually introduce peacekeepers into the region. And that would include the corridor that links Armenia with Nagorno-Karabakh. But yet that corridor remains Azerbaijani sovereign territory. So again, we have another. It basically is another frozen conflict that we've got going here, and under the terms of that agreement that was reached of allowing for the peacekeepers, it doesn't appear that there's going to be joint peacekeeping. It's going to be solely Russian peacekeepers, and they will be both in the north and south of Nagorno-Karabakh and throughout the corridor. And so that seems to have quelled emotions. And it also has prompted, I think, Erdogan to back off a little bit. And the understanding is that there wouldn't be the introduction any longer of any more Syrian jihadi Salafists as fighters, Turkish proxy fighters into the region. Well, that was also a condition.
Is it really a frozen conflict? I mean, at this point, sure, the Russians are going to be there in perpetuity. Azerbaijan has clear military dominance, where it doesn't seem like Armenia is ever going to be able to get the support, meaning monetarily or from any other nation, to give them any kind of potential for this. It seems like in perpetuity, this conflict, if conflict existed, I mean, I understand Armenia has feelings about it, but you can have feelings all day if you don't have the capacity to do anything about it. It's kind of besides the point. Is it?
Azerbaijan seems satisfied. Aliyev seems satisfied. That's the thing. I mean, the Azerbaijani forces seem like they've made the gains they want. Yeah, Michael.
Well, they got what they wanted. They were able to bring back Azerbaijani refugees back into Nagorno-Karabakh while still allowing Armenians to remain. Now, how long will that last? Who knows? That could create an internal civil war ultimately, and that's one of the three reasons why you have this. These peacekeepers in there. But it does bring to mind what happened back in 2008 over Abkhazia in Georgia. That was another frozen conflict in Georgia, and ultimately Russian peacekeepers were up there around South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and they were popped by Georgian snipers. So it was that caused then that caused the Russians to come on down as a result of the Russian peacekeepers being killed. Now, the only reason Russia hasn't stepped in militarily into the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh is that they would only introduce Russian troops if Armenia proper was attacked by Azerbaijan, and that is not going to be the case. So that's why I say it's a frozen conflict. Everybody got a little bit of something. There was a major compromise. Will it finally settle everything? I don't think it will in the eyes of the Armenians or the Armenians who are in Nagorno-Karabakh. That's why I call it still a frozen conflict. But tensions will have been lessened as a result of the presence of the Russian peacekeepers, and I think that they'll probably remain there almost in perpetuity.
We've only got maybe a minute, 2 minutes at max left. I want to go back to Turkey for just a second here. You were talking about how Russia will be the only nation with peacekeeping forces on the ground. Turkey, back in mid-November, Turkey's parliament actually approved them sending peacekeeping troops in. But at this point, it seems like they're not going to. It seems like it's just going to be a monitoring station. What is Turkey specifically, just to lay this out for a sort of layperson, what is Turkey looking for when they're trying to move their peacekeeping forces into the region, when they're trying to get troops on the ground? What do they want? What's in it for them?
Yeah, they have peacekeeping troops, but they're remaining in Azerbaijan proper. They're not being allowed to do joint patrols with the Russian peacekeepers in the Nagorno-Karabakh. That's the distinction. What's Turkey's motive? Erdogan has designs of expanding, of recreating a neo-Ottoman empire, and he's trying to reconnect with and reestablish Turkic influence in the entire region of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and he's been trying to do that in Syria. He's succeeded to a point. There's no telling when he's going to leave Syria, even though the Russians want him out, but they're not going to push him out.
Real quick, because we do have to close it out, but it's sort of like a thin edge of the wedge, trying to get a diplomatic foot in that door. And I mean, if they could have, if they could be co-patrolling Nagorno-Karabakh with the Russians, that would also be, a military presence. That's probably the case, right?
Yeah, I don't think the Russians will allow it.
Yeah,
Russians are not going to allow it. They're not pushing it.
I hear you. We've got to close this out. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Michael Maloof is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, also an author and a regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He comes to us with nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. We're going into a break, and on the other side of this break, we're going to be taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines. We will be back with you in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usually flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault lines.
And we're back and we're taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, we left an open thread much earlier on in the show. It had to do with the military-industrial complex. I'm sure that if we talk about it for like 5 seconds, I want to come back to it. I just forget exactly what it was. Do you remember what I'm talking? I think this is during the 8 a.m. headlines. So about an hour and a half ago. You remember what we were talking about by any chance?
Whether or not we're getting bang for the buck for the money that's expended in the military.
Yes. That is exactly it.
Yeah, because we spend so much, and we just assume that the $1 trillion is getting bang for the buck for the trillion. Now, half of it is to pay for personnel. So half of it is just the jobs program. And then you get to the other half of the weapons and those type of things that are being spent. And you ask yourself, we're assuming, like we're making assumptions that the systems are going to be necessary and pertinent in a war. And we're missing the point that other countries plan for that stuff. Like the first engagements aren't, what we need over time in military changes. I mean, at one point, the airplane becomes a dominant force. And they didn't even believe in the beginning that the airplane was going to be a dominant force. They was like, yeah, we don't see the military application of this. Well, air power becomes, preeminent. Like, I guess I'm saying, with all of the money that we're dumping and spending into these military applications, you do have to ask yourself whether or not that money is getting the bang for the buck. And honestly, could it be spent in other ways? And should we be dumping as much money in military in the first place if we could find, and I'm saying this from the standpoint of a population, not from the standpoint of a government. The government's perspectives and priorities are different than what the population is. But we just talked to Blankenship, Bradley, and he made the point of all of that money that was being spent for war that never came.
In the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
in the Soviet Union specifically. They're throwing massive amounts of money during the Cold War at their military. They could have been investing that in not just their economy in the abstract, but on the welfare of the people living in the Soviet Union. And they were caught, he wasn't blaming them necessarily. He wasn't attributing all of the blame to them because, of course, the U.S. and other Western post-Allied nations, they were also a part of that. Eisenhower was also in his administration, and the following administrations obviously responsible for pushing back in large part against the Soviets. Culpability on both sides is on both sides, but we're still living with that. So thank you. You brought the conversation back up. Another side of this, we talk about the monopoly on force sometimes. If you have a political monopoly, that's usually the context in which we're talking about this dynamic. If you have a political monopoly, then you get further and further unyoked from any sense of any direct political responsibility. Or if you have a duopoly, as we do in this country, that is effectively a monopoly. It's effectively, there's a single political class that, they cooperate when it really comes down to what's profitable through their investors in the financial classes, et cetera, and various corporations. And you lack all political responsibility. It gets completely unyoked from what the people, which is supposed to be the foundation of the whole political system, what the people actually want. Something similar seems to happen in the military. If you have a military monopoly, as we have since at the very latest, the 90s, then what you get is no sort of cost-benefit analysis of where your money's actually going because you don't have actual military conflicts. You have engagements. So you don't have any sort of one-to-one meeting of forces between a power and other powers or another power specifically, either between one-to-one or one-to-many. What you have is this sort of attempt to contain various forms of, militaristic dissent around the world. And what that means is you can dump as much money as you want to into the military without having any direct sense or accounting of where that money is going, because it becomes increasingly unyoked from where the money's going. You see what I'm saying, Jamarl? It's the same dynamic at play. You have a military monopoly, which means you just throw a bunch of your money. And of course, that's why if you look at where we spend our GDP, where we spend the ostensible income that we would bring in as a country, a lot of it just goes to the military. A lot of it goes to, gets funneled into the pockets of massive contractors, who are farmed out to by the DOD. It's gnarly. And then, of course, you come back, I think we read this on air a little while back, you come back to the Bill Hicks quote, what if you spent that money on exploring space and extending human lifespans and curing diseases and teaching people how to think more clearly? you couldn't recognize the world you'd live in. It'd be so completely separate, not just from our current generation, but literally from anything that we've lived through in the past, from all of human history. New peaks. You hear what I'm saying, Jamarl?
Yeah, Shane, but how would I dominate the rest of the globe in that scenario? And if I can't dominate the rest of the globe in that scenario, then I don't want that scenario. Even if it means that we're, 100 years behind where we should be. At the very least, we're 100 years behind where we should be with me in charge. And I think that's what it gets down to. It's this notion of dominance. And when one country chooses dominance, the other countries have to conform to it, or they're going to be dominated. Like, this is not a situation where everybody is free. I mean, there's some situations where a country can take a tack and political disposition that the other countries are isolated from. They can, or alienated. But if I am taking a perspective of dominance that demands that there's something else there, can't dominate myself, there has to be something else there. And if that something else there is you who want to be isolated, you're going to get captured. You're going to get taken. Meaning one disposition forces other groups, other countries, other people, whatever that is, they take a disposition in opposition to yours just because you are going after them. And so it's like, yeah, I mean, we could be farther, much farther ahead. But I think this question really does boil down to, what does this country want? What are its political ambitions? And do those political ambitions affect others around the globe? And the answer is, of course, yes. I would love for us to dump that money into those things that are awesome. But like you said, we have no idea what it looks like to have a peer-to-peer conflict currently. What we know of is a soldier kicking down the door and, somebody is poorly trained or poorly equipped, being basically captured or taken. I have no idea what that looks like in a peer-to-peer group where somebody that can stand toe-to-toe, that more likely not trying to conquer us, we're most likely trying to attack them, meaning we are getting closer and closer to their infrastructure and military base. I don't know what that looks like, nor do I want to know what that looks like, because that ends up in a nuclear conflict, I honestly believe, at this point. And so, yeah, it feels like the money that we're spending is just wasted. It's just dumped down the hole.
That's the problem. That's the problem with the balance of power thing. I mean, if you look back at the mid 20th century, that was the whole development, nuclear proliferation. It's like, if you think about a balance of power as being a lever, you're supposed to balance equal weights on opposite side of the lever, almost like the scales of justice or something like this. Well, if you put more and more weights on each side, if you put more and more weapons, nuclear armaments, whatever the case may be, you got to have a longer and longer lever. The sort of vehicles of power, the centralization of the state, these things need to increase concomitantly. They need to get bigger and bigger and more powerful and more dangerous, frankly, until at some point, if one of the sides starts to break down, then what you're left with is this radically uneven, radically dangerous world state, which seems to be where we are right now. I mean, you're bringing it back to balance of power as like a potential solution of these problems. Isn't that what happens on the other side of that way of looking at things?
Yes.
I get what you're saying about this sort of peer-to-peer ethic, but we're living in that. We're living in the breakdown of that peer-to-peer ethic when you have massive weaponry, just a world-threatening,
well, two things.
Incredibly potent weaponry.
Breakdown and rebuilding of it. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed. Fair enough. The United States thought they won. And this multipolar world ended up in, or this dual polar world ended up into this singular, monopolar. Well, now you have China. Now you have Russia. You have, India at some point is going to be putting stuff in space. Like, this is not the singular power world anymore. It's multi-power. And I agree with you. And I even come to this question, is there a difference between, let's say, a world with a balanced power, let's say nuclear deterrence and everything else, versus a world without those things? Meaning, if I take 3 from one side of the equation, I take 3 from the other side of the equation, you still end out with balance. We never come to that conclusion from the standpoint of, okay, what if we just get rid of these weapons and everybody stays, meaning if we are going to have that level of balance with a ton of weaponry, isn't it the same having that balance without it? But that never comes to the conclusion, because at the end of the day, the dominance factor comes into play. And whatever advantage one has, one wants to maintain that advantage, which means they need to either add more when somebody else tries to catch up, or the other people never try to catch up, which always instantiates the advantage.
Is moral development real, Jamarl? Is there such a thing as human beings becoming more ethical or more spiritually advanced or more law-based? Like, there are these different ways of looking at it. Because if it's not, I'm not saying it's inevitable, but if there is no such thing as moral development, then you're always going to be stuck in this problem. But we've got like a minute left. Is that possible? Not even inevitable, but is it possible?
Yes. We don't have gladiators killing each other now. We don't have slaves. So clearly, the society can develop, the society can expand ethically, morally, but those things are emergent depending upon the environmental factors that are available. Meaning, when you have a situation where technology allows more food production, okay, then more people can eat. Does it make people more ethical? Well, we don't know. If you get to a situation where food production goes away, do the old values come back? Because those old values were mandated by the environment themselves. I suspect that our ethics and morals are continuously tied to our environmental circumstances. That's what
so it's not something. And I hear what you're saying. It's not something endemic to human nature. It's something that we sort of allow ourselves to be more ethical because we live in a system that makes that possible, that makes that durable.
Exactly.
Broadly. Anyway, high-flying conversations, always fun to have with my fantastic co-host, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you, producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, Andre, our engineer. You know who you are, buddy. And thank you, that is you, for listening. Also, thank you to all of our guests for joining us as guests on this show. We're going to be back tomorrow, folks. Have a great day. See you then.
And another one is in the record books, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Guys, I am not going to be able to stay too much for the pre-show today. My dog is ill. Bo, he's sick. My wife took him to the emergency room at like 5 o'clock this morning. 5 o'clock is roughly around the time I was getting ready for the show. So I wake up. She's like, he's been sick all night. And I had said early on that I wanted to take him to the ER, but we were trying to see if he was going to do any better. He did not. We haven't been able to feed him. He hasn't been able to eat. And this is the dog that eats everything. The dog ate a pack of gloves, to put it in perspective in regards to where his appetite is. So when he loses it, it becomes what happens. He's been having a rough year. He had cancer at one point. We got that removed. Like I say, he had the pack of gloves that required surgery because those things got stuck in his intestines. And now there's something Giardia or something to that effect. He's having some kind of intestinal thing. So I'm going to go check on her and him. The thing is, nowadays with everything going on with COVID, if you are into the ER, human ER, if you are going to doctor's visits, oftentimes they don't allow people to go back with them. That's problematic on multiple counts because the last thing you want is a person who's ill at the whims of either the hospital without somebody backing them that can look out for their best interests. Well, the same thing is true for vets now. They don't necessarily allow you to go back with the dog, which again presents all sorts of problems when you have a dog that's a little weirded and freaked out by the whole doctor thing, especially with all of the issues that he's had over the year. So I'm going to go up and check. So you may or may not see me later today. It depends on what's going on for the day. But I will say like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.